Hey guys! Tonight we're cracking open a chapter of history that's equal parts forbidden, ridiculous, and strangely relatable. You probably won't find this in any high school syllabus, but if you've ever wondered how desire survived under layers of wool, candle smoke, and moral panic, well, this one's for you. Just a heads up. You probably won't survive this, not because it's too spicy, although yes, there will be demons with warm breath and monks whispering things they really shouldn't, but because if you had lived in medieval times with even a mildly curious libido, chances are you'd be punished, flogged, or politely locked away. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and while you're at it, let me know. What city are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at a monastery just after Vespers, when the sky is still tinted with the last grey-pink bruises of sunset, and the cold starts creeping in through the wool of your borrowed robe. You're here seeking silence, peace, maybe a glimpse into medieval devotion. What you get is a little more complicated. The air smells of beeswax, damp stone, and a suspicious note of boiled cabbage somewhere. A candle flickers like it's trying to whisper a secret. Your guide, Brother Matthias, doesn't say much, but his eyes dart too quickly when you pass the chapel's side door, and you swear he blushes when someone mentions Sister Agnes. You follow the shuffle of feet, the rustle of robes, the clink of rosaries. Everything is orderly, humble, sacred, and yet, behind every pillar seems to be a war of twitching fingers and stolen glances. Here's your first uncomfortable fact. Monks were not, in fact, blank slates of holiness. They were men asked to deny their bodies while living in a highly structured world that gave them very little else to do but pray, copy scripture, and try not to notice that Brother Thomas had really nice hands. And it turns out that denying something doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it louder. You slip into the scriptorium, where the monks copy texts with deliberate precision. One brother's quill scratches the word abstinence into a line of Latin, while his other hand fiddles with the hem of his robe like it might offer answers. A lot of these men joined as teenagers. Some had never touched a woman. Others had, and regretted it loudly, especially during confession, but maybe not honestly. The church taught that lust was the original enemy of the soul. Not greed, not pride, not sloth, but lust. Because lust could sneak in during prayer, during sleep, during silence. Monasteries became pressure cookers for desire. And it got weird, really weird. You find a record written by a 12th century abbot who claimed the devil tormented him by flashing images of naked women while he was at the altar. In response, he repeatedly slammed his face into the cold stone floor to calm himself down. According to his own words, this did not work. You can't help wondering if the devil had better timing than the abbot gave him credit for. Historians still argue whether this kind of thing was metaphor, madness, or deeply repressed guilt turned into narrative. But one thing is clear, monks weren't immune. In fact, isolation might have made it worse. No distractions, no variety, just long days filled with chanting and guilt. And then there were the records. Monasteries didn't just have rules. They wrote everything down. Everything. You stumble across a scroll detailing how one monk struggled with lust after dreaming of a statue of Saint Cecilia. Yes, the statue. He confessed the dream, fasted for 3 days, and then carved a small wooden saint with extra clothing, just in case. That carving still exists. You're not sure if it helped. The real scandal, though, wasn't the dreams, it was the relationships. Despite every rule and sermon, secret romances flourished. In one French monastery, both the male and female communities of a double monastery were discovered having what one bishop dryly referred to as an unsanctioned gathering under the stars. That gathering turned out to involve wine, music, and quite a lot of very literal entanglement. The church shut it down and rebranded the whole thing as a brothel in disguise. That's the thing. The more rules there were, the more inventive people became. Hidden letters, nighttime visits, carved symbols tucked into the edges of manuscripts. Desire always found its way in. You pause in the cloisters and notice a peculiar engraving beneath a bench. It's faint, nearly lost to time, but unmistakable. 2 hands clasped. Just hands. Tender, quiet, and somehow more moving than any fresco. You wonder who carved it, and whether they ever said out loud what it meant. One particularly determined monk, let's call him Hinrich, claimed he had trained himself to dream psalms, literally reciting holy verses in his sleep to drown out anything lustful. This was his medieval version of lucid dreaming. Dream yoga meets monastic guilt. Was it true? Maybe, but it tells you something deeper. How desperate these men were to control something they never asked to fight. Still, it wasn't all horror and guilt. Some monks found peace. A few even claimed to have reached spiritual purity so complete they no longer thought of sex at all. Of course, they also wrote that down at length, and with suspicious frequency. Historians still debate whether these confessions were sincere or aspirational, like a medieval version of editing your browser history before someone checks. You pass a locked cabinet in the monastery library. Inside are bound confessionals, private, forgotten, but not erased. You run your hand along the cover of one and think of the men who poured out their shame onto these pages, shame that felt eternal at the time, but now it's just ink and echoes. As you walk out into the cool courtyard, the chant of Vespers begins behind you. Low, solemn, almost beautiful, but you can't help hearing a different note beneath it now, a kind of tension, a yearning stitch between the syllables. You glance back at Brother Matthias. He's watching the chapel, not you, and for a moment, you see it, the tired kindness in his eyes, the weight of vows that never quite silence the body. The stars begin to prick the sky. The bells toll, and you move on, deeper into the night. Behind you, the monastery stands still, but not silent. The gate creaks behind you as you step out of the monastery and into the hushed, walled world of the convent next door. You expect silence, maybe some chanting, definitely the faint smell of incense. What you don't expect is roasted onions. But there it is, sharp and a little defiant, wafting up from a sun-warmed kitchen garden like a culinary protest against piety. You follow the sound of quiet footsteps across the courtyard. Nuns glide past in habits that flap like sails in the breeze, their eyes respectfully lowered, hands folded, back straight, but the silence here doesn't feel sacred. It feels dense, like a story that's been carefully folded and refolded so many times it now fits neatly in the space between eye contact and prayer. Inside, the convent is orderly. Too orderly, the walls are pale and worn. The windows let in light that falls in perfect geometric slices on the stone floors. Everything looks correct. Everything looks devout. And yet, you feel it. That unmistakable human hum under the surface. The tension of too much discipline. Too much closeness. Too many rules pretending to erase the body. You're led into the library by a nun who smiles at you with the calm confidence of someone who knows you're not the first visitor to underestimate this place. She smells faintly of ink and lavender and something older, like beeswax and unspoken history. She unlocks a narrow cabinet with an iron key, gestures toward the top shelf, and says, "These are not for the choir girls." Then she leaves. What you find there is not doctrine, not scripture, not dry theological commentary. What you find are private writings. Fragile pages, edges crumbling like shortbread, diaries, letters, prayers tucked between stanzas of poetry, some written in code, others shockingly blunt, and every single one vibrating with a longing that's as human as it is holy. One passage reads like a dream. A nun writes of being embraced by the Virgin Mary, held close with a tenderness that sounds distinctly less maternal and more electric. Another entry describes an angel who visits her night after night, kissing her mouth until she wakes up breathless and confused. She writes, "I'm either blessed or doomed, and I'm not certain which I hope for." You stare at the page for a long time. The ink is faded. The ache is not. Then there's the one about Sister Clara. You almost miss it at first. Just a tiny folded slip of parchment tucked between 2 pages of Augustine. It's a short poem, unsigned, but intimate in a way that needs no signature. The writer compares Clara's hair to sun-warmed wheat, and her hand, during prayer, to the cool edge of mercy. There's nothing explicitly improper, but it's clear whoever wrote this was in love, or very close to it. You learn that convent dormitories, particularly in colder climates, often paired nuns together for warmth, 2 to a bed, sometimes 3. It was practical, economical, sensible. It was also, predictably, occasionally complicated. Historians still argue whether these bonds were platonic or romantic, whether the poetry passed between them was devotional or deeply personal. One camp claims it was all spiritual metaphor. The other points out that if your metaphor involves tracing the curve of someone's collarbone by candlelight, you may want to rethink your liturgical training. One letter you find is addressed simply to the one whose voice haunts me in sleep. It's unsigned, but buried beneath a cherry tree, according to a note on the back. And then there are the records. Not love notes, but incident reports. That's right, some abbesses kept logs. Astonishingly honest logs. You come across a brief but vivid entry about a nun caught with a visiting monk, under a staircase, during Vespers. They were both assigned additional prayer hours and temporarily separated. Another entry refers cryptically to unusual fondness expressed between Sister Alda and the butcher's daughter, who arrived claiming to be a novice. You wonder how one smuggles a butcher's daughter into a cloister. Then you stop wondering. It clearly wasn't her first time. And here's your quirky detail of the night. In a 14th century convent in Italy, a group of nuns was discovered hosting masked dances with hired musicians. They drank wine, wore garlands, and danced until sunrise. When the bishop came to investigate, they told him they were enacting the joy of resurrection. He was not amused, but also, he didn't shut the place down. Why? Half the dancers were related to bishops, because of course they were. Not everything was scandal. Some of these women were intellectual powerhouses, bored out of their skulls. Yes, but brilliant. You find references to Plato, Ovid's, Galen, copies of texts hidden beneath layers of psalms. One nun scribbled notes on natural fertility control in the margins of a manuscript about St. Margaret. Another wrote a side essay arguing that divine love and carnal love were not opposites, but mirrors. You imagine her sitting there, quill in hand, eyes fierce, writing something no one ever intended her to say. And then there's Hildegard of Bingen, composer, mystic, visionary, possibly the first woman to describe the female orgasm in theological language. She wrote that a woman's soul could be impregnated by divine inspiration. Some modern scholars read that as proto-feminist spiritual queerness. Others call it metaphor. One called it terribly inefficient theology. You call it gutsy. Hildegard also wrote intensely affectionate letters to another nun named Richardis. When Richardis was reassigned to another convent, Hildegard's grief poured out like a breakup album in Latin. She begged God to reverse the decision. He didn't, but the letters remain, still. Many of these women didn't choose convent life. You read one line from a diary that simply says, "I do not love my vows, but I obey them." That sentence stays with you longer than anything else in the cabinet. Some were second daughters, too poor to marry well, or too many siblings down the line to be considered valuable in the marriage market. Others were sent away because of scandal, or because their family needed to save on dowries. The convent was safety, but it was also exile, and for those who didn't adapt, there were always the rebels. You find references to nuns sneaking out of the convent at night to visit taverns. One even took a lover, possibly a poet, possibly two. When she was caught, she claimed she was testing the limits of obedience. She was reassigned, not expelled. Why? Her brother was a bishop. Again, you walk through the stone halls, the candlelight flickering just enough to make the shadows move. You begin to hear the convent differently now, not as a place of stillness, but as a place of tension, as a theatre of discipline where longing sat quietly beside duty, and where silence had teeth. As you pass back through the library, you glance at the parchment one last time. The poem about Clara, the author had written in the margin, "I have fasted, I have prayed, but still her voice is the clearest psalm I know." You fold it carefully, return it to its hiding place, close the cabinet. Outside, the wind lifts the linen on the washing line. You hear laughter from the kitchen. One of the novices is tossing an onion to the laundry assistant, a young woman with short hair and a crooked smile. She catches it, winks, and disappears around the corner, and you have a strong suspicion that laundry wasn't the only thing that needed folding tonight. You leave the convent under a sky smudged with ash-coloured clouds, the scent of vinegar and pressed herbs still clinging faintly to your robe. But instead of heading back toward the village or into the woods where temptation at least wears a familiar shape, you step into something stranger. A small chapel sits at the edge of a crumbling path, half swallowed by ivy, its doorway crooked like a mouth mid-sigh. Inside, dust motes hang in beams of slanted sunlight. The altar's faded red cloth is frayed at the corners. A cracked basin of holy water holds more memory than moisture. And in the corner, wedged between two mismatched candle stands, is a wooden chest, plain, unlocked, unbothered. You lift the lid expecting psalters, sermons, maybe a recipe for barley soup sanctified by the church. But no, what you find is more shocking than sin, because it's been sanctioned, canonized. Even, you are holding the vitae, the official life stories, of saints, holy people, untouchable, or so you thought. But as you flip through these pages, you don't find discipline or cold detachment from the world. You find passion, temptation, visions, and not the kind you'd bring to Sunday school. Saints, as it turns out, dream vividly, and when they do, their dreams often involve flame, pierced hearts, and heavenly visitors with suspiciously tender hands. Take Saint Anthony the Great. For instance, he fled to the desert to escape temptation. Classic strategy. Get away from the cities, from the women, from the whispers. And what did he find out there? Visions of women, naked, shimmering, throwing themselves at him like sandstone sirens. His solution? He dove into a thorn bush, literally, scratched himself bloody to smother the desire. Historians still argue whether that worked, or if it just added a new kind of itch. Then there's Saint Teresa of Avila, technically later than the medieval period, but spiritually right at home with these mystics. She wrote of an angel piercing her heart with a golden spear, filling her with ecstasy so intense it left her weeping and trembling, consumed by love that burned and ravished and filled her soul to overflowing. She published that. The church printed it. And somewhere, a monk definitely needed a cold bath. You start to realize the boundary between piety and pleasure is thinner than parchment. The page falls open to a tale of St. Catherine of Siena, who took a vow of virginity at the age of 7, because nothing screams autonomy like a child pledging celibacy before she's lost her milk teeth. As an adult, she claimed to be spiritually married to Christ. Not metaphorically. She said she wore an invisible wedding ring, made from, brace yourself, the foreskin of Jesus. Yes, that's a thing she said. A divine relic no museum dares display. You pause, reread the line, blink, and yes, it still says what you think it says. This is where hagiography, the storytelling genre of saintly lives, gets weird, because it's not just about documenting miracles and moral triumphs. It's also where the lines blur between devotion and desire, between mysticism and metaphor, between a vision of heaven and something that sounds like a fevered diary entry written after midnight. And it's not just the women. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux wrote of longing for union with God so intense. He described being drawn into divine embrace with words more suited for a romance novel than a monastery. He called Christ the bridegroom of the soul, and spoke of kisses, not metaphorical ones, mind you, but kisses he claimed to feel soft, lingering, real. Other male saints reported dreams of Jesus appearing to them in radiant human form, gentle-eyed, fragrant, glowing. They wrote of joy so overwhelming they lost the ability to speak, to breathe, to move. Was it holiness? Was it sublimated longing? Was it, as some scholars suggest, the only safe way for emotionally and sexually starved people to process human affection? Historians still debate that. Some say these were purely symbolic. Others argue these experiences were deeply sensory, emotional, and yes, possibly erotic, just expressed through the only acceptable framework available. You find one passage from Saint Lardis, a 13th century mystic, who claimed that Christ kissed her on the mouth like a groom would kiss a bride, and I tasted honey on his breath. In one vision, he placed his hand on her heart and she felt a rushing warmth that made the stars sing. Sure, stars. Definitely not hormones. Moving on, what strikes you is not just the language, it's the emotional urgency. These weren't cold reports of doctrine. These were confessions, yearnings, deep, trembling expressions of people trying to make sense of something too intense for the vocabulary they had. And if that meant calling it divine ecstasy instead of physical longing, so be it. You glance down at a marginal note in one manuscript, scribbled in cramped script beside a description of holy fire in the belly. Someone had written, "Is this metaphor or madness?" It wasn't signed. You suspect the author didn't want to be traced. There's something almost tragic here. These saints weren't liars. They weren't manipulating the system. They were genuinely trying to climb out of their flesh and into something eternal. But the ladder they used was built from the very thing they were told to suppress. And it gets stranger. Some saints began to enjoy their visions. What started as torment became awe. They wrote about being ravished. Yes, but also cherished. Delighted. One nun described a night vision where an angel fed her rose petals and sang to her while stroking her forehead. It made her cry. It also made her write a 6-page poem, most of it about the angel's hands. That's the emotional paradox. These weren't people indulging lust. These were people who had been taught from birth that their bodies were shameful, that desire was damnation, and when they felt pleasure, they didn't know where to put it, so they gave it to God. In a way, it's brilliant. If society says you can't desire anyone, but you still feel something, redirect it upward. Transform longing into holiness. Convert arousal into revelation. Turn a kiss into salvation. Or, as one scholar put it, a form of theological drag, the saints donned the costume of spiritual purity, but underneath, they were wrestling with the same mess of feelings everyone else had. Fear, hope, lust, love, loneliness. You flip through more pages. Every few entries, you find a phrase that sounds almost contemporary. I wanted to be seen. He touched me like I mattered. Her voice pulled me from despair. These are not the fantasies of deluded ascetics. These are human beings with fragile, burning hearts, trying to translate their inner chaos into something divine. And they weren't just read. They were celebrated. These visions weren't hidden away. They were copied, preserved, distributed, used in sermons and instructional texts, held up as models of piety. The church, perhaps unintentionally, canonized desire wrapped in silk and scripture. You glance up at the stained glass above the altar. It shows Saint Agnes in a moment of prayer. Her face serene, her eyes closed, but the curve of her lips, soft, the tilt of her neck, vulnerable, and behind her, faint but deliberate, a painted hand reaching down from the heavens, not stern or commanding, but tender, curious, even in glass. The tension lives on. As you close the manuscript and return it to its chest, you feel a strange reverence, not for the saints themselves, but for what they dared to express. They lived in a world that demanded silence around the body, but they spoke anyway. In code, in poetry, in dream, you step back into the afternoon light. Blinking, somewhere behind you, a choir begins to sing. The melody is soft, ethereal, but you hear it now for what it is, not a rejection of the world, but an embrace of something bigger than rules, something tangled and human and holy in its hunger. The smell hits you before the doorway does. Roasted meats, lavender oil, and the faint but undeniable musk of too many people trying too hard to look like they're not trying. You step through the grand arched entry of a noble's hall somewhere in southern France, where everything is velvet, candlelight, and low, humming music, lutus, of course, always lutes. Nobody has smiled in 15 minutes, and yet everyone appears deeply, performatively in love. Welcome to the theatre of courtly love, a place where flirting is both performance and punishment, and every ankle revealed beneath a silken hem is a 5-act tragedy in the making. You watch as a knight kneels, yes, actually kneels, before a woman who is actively pretending he doesn't exist. He speaks softly, describing how her voice once shattered his will to fight. She responds with the kind of smile that could cause a diplomatic incident if aimed at the wrong cousin. Around them, other couples circle like costumed satellites, exchanging glances so weighted with subtext you could hang a tapestry on them. This is no accident. In the courts of love, longing isn't a glitch. It's the entire system. The rules are strict. You may desire her, but you must never touch her. You may pledge your loyalty, sing her praises, carry her token into battle. But you may not ask her to dinner, not unless you want to be exiled or worse, considered gauche. The idea, so popular among troubadours and noble poets, is that true love is spiritual, untouched, unfulfilled. The more tortured, the more noble. You are not supposed to have her. You are supposed to ache for her forever. That's the point. A historian once described it as emotional flagellation dressed in silk. And frankly, he wasn't wrong. It all started, so the story goes, in 12th century Aquitaine, with Eleanor, the Duchess, queen, and perennial troublemaker, who practically invented the romantic salon. She and her court of ladies would gather to debate the rules of love like it was theological doctrine. Can a man love more than one woman at once? Should a lady encourage jealousy? Is a married woman fair game for a noble knight if he writes really excellent poetry? These weren't just hypotheticals. They were blueprints for behaviour, and that behaviour rapidly became canon. You observe one couple in the corner exchanging gloves. Yes, gloves. Hers is delicately embroidered, perfumed, and possibly dipped in moonlight. He tucks it into his armour like he's just been handed the Grail. She sips wine from a gold goblet and continues talking to someone else. He looks ready to duel a dragon just for the chance to smell her wrist again. This is courtly love, simultaneously absurd and sincere, performative and deeply personal. And somehow, despite the layers of silk and social tension, it works. You flip through a nearby book of court poetry, and every page is a variation on the same theme. I saw her. I died. She smiled. I revived. She spoke to someone else. I died again. One particularly dramatic stanza reads, "Her foot brushed the stone and I wept for the dust." It's unclear whether the author needs a hug or a hobby. Here's your historical fun fact. Entire poems were written. Long, epic, weeping poems about toes, ankles, elbows glimpsed in candlelight. These were not exaggerations. These were the highlights. And yet, the moment anyone actually consummated the relationship, the poetry stopped, because now it was real. And real wasn't poetic. Real was messy and slightly disappointing. Historians still argue whether these relationships were as chaste as advertised. On parchment, they were, but off the page, well, let's just say not every scarf exchanged in secret stayed on the arm. Political marriages left little room for romance, so love had to be found elsewhere. In quiet gardens, in letters, in accidental handbrushes during a shared chess game. You trail a pair of nobles down a corridor lit by torchlight. They speak in verse, not metaphorically, literally in verse. She recites a riddle. He replies with a sonnet. The walls around them are covered in frescoes of tragic lovers who never quite touched. Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere. The classics, stories where desire ruins everything, and still somehow feels more noble than actual happiness. One of the troubadours strums his lute near the hearth, singing about a lady whose hair he once glimpsed in a reflection. The lyrics go on for several verses about the reflection, not her, just the hair, in water, because apparently nothing says passion like staring at a pond and collapsing into a swoon. And yet, beneath the ridiculousness, something real stirs, because in a world where love was often arranged, dictated, or purely strategic, this courtly longing was a form of resistance. A way to say, I choose to want, even if I can't have. Women in these courts weren't passive. They had power. They set the terms. They responded to letters with coded sarcasm. They selected which knights to favour, and which to publicly ignore until their poetic despair became the talk of the castle. It was a chess game, and they were holding the queen. You spot a woman dropping a handkerchief near the stairwell, intentionally, delicately. A man rushes to retrieve it. She thanks him without making eye contact and vanishes behind a curtain. That's an entire novella in 7 seconds. But it wasn't all performance. Sometimes these games became real. One famous affair involved a lady who promised a knight her everlasting favour if he carved her name into an enemy's shield. He did, bloodily, and she later snuck him into her tower room for a private audience. The letter she sent afterward survives. It mentions nothing about the battle, only the way his hands trembled. Still, it wasn't safe. A single rumour could destroy a reputation. Love was noble, lust was sin. The church barely tolerated the metaphor. They did not want the reality. In fact, courtly love was often seen as dangerously secular, too focused on earthly beauty, not divine love, too much poetry, not enough penitence. But again, it was hard to police a compliment. If a knight wrote, "Your voice is like light upon the snow," who could say what he meant? Maybe he admired her soul. Maybe he was losing his mind. Maybe both. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In some courts, literary duels were held where men would recite poems in competition, judged not on rhyme but on how passionately they could pine. The winner got a kiss. The loser got to write another poem. Everyone cried. You follow a trail of whispering footsteps through the corridor until you reach a small antechamber. 2 figures stand close, barely touching. They aren't speaking, just breathing in sync. One wears the pendant of a married lady. The other wears dusted armour. They glance toward the door, then back at each other. You step away. The curtain falls on the moment. Later that evening, you find yourself at the back of the great hall again, watching a young knight sit alone, scribbling into a book with the intensity of someone bleeding onto the page. You peek over his shoulder. He's writing about a dance. one that never happened. He watched her spin once, he writes, just once, and now she lives in every step he takes. You don't laugh, because somehow, in the ridiculousness, in the aching and the ruffles and the endless lute solos, you see it. The human need to want something more than we're allowed, to turn distance into devotion, to wrap ache in lace and call it virtue. You leave the hall just as the musicians change to a slower tune. Behind you, nobles smile without quite meaning it. Servants refill cups with wine that doesn't taste as rich as the longing hanging in the room. Courtly love isn't about having, it's about wanting so fiercely it becomes sacred. Or, at the very least, survivable, you trade velvet for mud, silk for straw, and candle-lit longing for the unmistakable aroma of wet earth, cabbage stew, and a goat with attitude. Welcome to the village, where love doesn't wear lace, it wears hand-me-down tunics, and where romance isn't written in verse, it's whispered across a pig pen while someone's mother pretends not to hear. You're standing in the centre of a northern European hamlet, probably England, maybe France, certainly somewhere with an aggressive rooster. The homes are timber-framed, slouching against each other like sleepy drunks. Thatched roofs drip from a recent rain, and the paths between cottages are a treacherous mix of mud, and something that may or may not be manure. You stop asking. Here, there are no salons, no troubadours, and no one's writing poems about ankles. There are, however, bundling bags. Yes, that's real. Imagine this. 2 teenagers, betrothed or at least flirtatiously circling the idea, are permitted, encouraged even, to lie in bed together, fully clothed, supervised, sometimes with a literal plank of wood between them. The goal? Talk, get to know each other, build trust, but mostly, test what their parents politely call compatibility, and what everyone else just quietly acknowledges as curiosity wrapped in wool. Historians still argue whether these bundling rituals were symbolic exercises in restraint, or thinly veiled invitations for premarital intimacy. One side insists they were moral safety nets. The other points out that teenagers, and zero privacy as a trifecta no linen barrier can withstand. You peek into a cottage, ducking under the low wooden beam that clearly doesn't believe in tall visitors. Inside is one room. One bed in the corner, cooking fire near the centre, baby in a sling on the beam, grandfather snoring in the corner, and if the goat from earlier isn't family, he's not far off. Privacy, not really a thing, but that never stopped anyone. In fact, love in the peasant world is noisy, public, messy, and somehow far more honest. You don't have time for layers of metaphor when the roof leaks. Romance happens in glances during harvest, in whispered jokes while gutting fish, in hands brushing while thatching a roof. The courting rituals are earthy, practical, sometimes sweet, sometimes muddy, always direct. You hear about wedding night inspections. 2, a very real, very invasive tradition in which the village elders, or in some truly unfortunate cases, the bride's own relatives, would check the bedsheets for proof of consummation. That meant blood, which meant virginity, which meant everyone could rest easy, knowing honour was intact and no one had to return a dowry goat. Quirky fact of the night. Some brides pre-stained the linens with animal blood, just to ensure a smooth morning after. It's unclear whether anyone believed it, or whether everyone just agreed to pretend it was real, so they could get back to more pressing issues, like famine. Marriage itself wasn't always a big event here. Sometimes it was a church ceremony, sometimes it was a handshake in front of witnesses and a shared loaf of bread. If 2 people lived together, worked the land, and were seen by the community as a couple, that was usually enough. The church, of course, preferred formal vows, but in practice, local custom often outweighed clerical protocol. You pass a young couple near a water trough. She's barefoot, elbow deep in laundry. He's supposed to be helping, but instead he's making a crude joke about soap and virtue. She rolls her eyes, then smiles. It's not subtle. It doesn't need to be, this is courtship, peasant edition, mostly chores, occasional winks, and a mutual understanding that you'll probably end up married if the goat doesn't object. Still, even down here among the pitchforks and chickens, there are rules. There are lines you don't cross, or if you do, you cross them carefully. Adultery is risky, especially if the offended party is of higher status. A farmhand caught with the reeve's daughter might be fined, or flogged, or asked to leave the village entirely. But if two people of equal standing tumble into the haystack and no one complains, that's another matter. Punishment, if it happens at all, is often handled communally. Public penance, mild shame, a few whispered jokes at market. In one recorded tradition called Charivari, a man who marries poorly, too young, too old, too scandalous, is paraded through the village on a donkey while everyone bangs pots and pans and hurls creative insults. It's somewhere between mob justice and medieval stand-up comedy. You imagine being mocked while sitting backward on a stubborn donkey, and you realise that's probably more effective than jail time. There's a midwife in the village, broad-shouldered, gap-toothed, quick-witted, who pulls you aside while wringing out a rag that could double as a confession. The Lord keeps his sermons, she says. Babies come when they want. She's delivered dozens, some from married couples, some not. She doesn't flinch either way. She even jokes about how many noblemen have left blessings in village cradles. And yes, that's a euphemism. The noblemen's children, if born to peasant women, often grew up unacknowledged, absorbed into the fabric of village life, unless, of course, the mother made too much noise. Then things got inconvenient. You find a carving in a tree near the edge of the forest. 2 initials, a crude heart, a date from 20 years ago. Locals say the tree grants protection for lovers too poor to buy a priest's blessing. Just carve your names, kiss the bark, and trust the wind. Romantic, maybe. Cheap, definitely. Effective. Who's to say? The tree's still standing. The woodswomen, though, they're a different story. You hear whispers about them. Young girls who got pregnant, fled shame, and vanished into the forest. Some say they practice folk magic. Others claim they just wanted quiet. Either way, they trade in herbs passed hand to hand, teas that regulate cycles, roots that encourage or prevent conception. None of it is written down. All of it is remembered. And here comes your scholarly debate of the night. How common was sex before marriage in medieval villages? Church records suggest high rates of premarital penalties, but many argue those records only show the cases that cause scandal. The rest, well, people aren't known for self-reporting quiet evenings behind a haystack. Desire, it seems, isn't deterred by lack of privacy. If anything, it adapts, becomes quiet, strategic, shared glances over bread dough, brief meetings behind barns, a smile held just a moment too long. There's a simplicity to it all. Not innocent, but not performative. Either it's survival layered with tenderness. When life is hard, short, and unforgiving, the moments you find comfort matter more than whether they follow doctrine. You watch as 2 children chase each other through the mud, laughing with a joy completely oblivious to social convention. One of them runs into a goose. The goose is not amused. Everyone scatters, including the adults. The moment passes, but the warmth stays. Down here, sex isn't whispered behind confessionals or wrapped in riddles. It's part of life, messy, necessary, occasionally scandalous, but mostly human. You step out of the village as dusk begins to settle, smoke curling from chimneys like thoughts too warm to put into words. Someone is singing a lullaby. Someone else is swearing at a stubborn donkey. A baby cries. A couple argues, then laughs. It's not romantic, but it's real. You step into the church at the edge of town just as the bells finish their long, echoing toll. The air inside is cooler than outside, a still pocket of incense smoke and worn stone, faintly sweet with old wax and older secrets. Stained glass bleeds red and gold light across the pews, where a few stragglers pretend not to be judging each other. You move quietly, past the altar, past a statue of a weeping saint that looks like she's been crying for centuries, and toward a small wooden box in the shadows. The confessional, the place where shame goes to stretch its legs. You pull back the curtain, slip inside, and kneel on the little bench that squeaks with the full volume of your intent. Across the screen, a throat clears. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. You begin, because that's the script. Even if you're not sure which sins you're here for yet, there's a pause. Then the priest leans forward, and in a tone far too alert for this hour, says, "Which kind?" You blink. Excuse me, he doesn't miss a beat. Was it the neighbour's wife kind? Or the night thoughts kind? Or the self-pollution variety? This is where you realise something. He's not just here to absolve, he's also collecting data, because in medieval confession, priests didn't just listen. They tracked, catalogued, sorted. One friar, Brother Luca of Bologna, even kept a leather-bound ledger with tallies for each kind of sin. Not names, mind you, just counts. Like a holy spreadsheet. According to him, Mondays had the most confessions about lust. Wednesdays saw a spike in dreams. Sundays were surprisingly low, unless a feast day was involved. He called it pattern recognition. Everyone else called it nosy. You whisper something vague. The priest hums, then asks for clarification. How long did it last? He says, were there thoughts involved? Visuals? Instruments. You're not sure if this is a confessional or an audition. Welcome to the medieval version of spiritual therapy, where the line between pastoral care and low-grade curiosity gets blurred. Confession wasn't just about cleansing the soul. It was about control, understanding who wanted what, when, how often, and whether they cried afterward. And here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 13th century, annual confession was mandatory for all Christians in good standing. That's right. Once a year, you were required to spill everything. Voluntarily, in practice. Many people came far more often, some out of guilt, some out of fear, and some, well, because they had stories. You shift uncomfortably on the kneeler as the priest offers a follow-up question that would make your grandmother faint. He seems unfazed, almost enthusiastic, and you realize that for many rural priests, this was the highlight of the week, not because they were perverse, but because it broke the silence and gave them insight into what their flocks were actually doing when not spinning wool or baking barley cakes. One widow, apparently, came every week just to confess that she thought about her old lover while churning butter. She once brought her own rosary for emphasis. There's also a quiet understanding that not all priests keep it strictly professional. Parish priests were supposed to be celibate, but enforcement was, let's say, flexible, especially in remote villages where bishops showed up once every few years. And the chickens knew more about your habits than the church did. You hear stories of Father Gerard, who allegedly took confessions only after dusk, and only from women. His confessional candle was always the last to go out. Eventually, the bishop moved him to another parish. Not for punishment, just for variety. There was no trial, just a quiet reassignment and a suspiciously enthusiastic welcome party in the next town. And it's not just him. Another priest, Brother Pius, was known to prescribe very specific penances, not 5 Hail Marys, but things like walk barefoot through the chapel, reciting Psalm 51, and avoid dairy for 2 weeks. No explanation. Just the assumption that suffering built character and cleared your browser history. You whisper a fabricated sin just to change the subject. The priest sighs, disappointed, then absolves you with a prayer that feels more like a footnote. As you step out of the booth, blinking into the filtered light, you wonder just how many confessions were real, and how many were tailored to match what the priest expected, or hoped, to hear. Historians still debate whether the confessional offered genuine spiritual relief, or acted as a tool of psychological surveillance. One camp says it gave people a place to unburden, another claims it kept communities in line by making everyone obsessed with their own failings. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere between the psalm and the gossip column, because here's the secret. The priest talked, not publicly, not officially, but whispered in the refectory, murmured between sips of wine, or passed along when visiting neighbouring parishes. Not names, of course, just themes, patterns, frequencies. There's even a record of a priest in Avignon compiling a handwritten sermon series titled Temptations of the Flock, based entirely on anonymised confessions. It was widely circulated, and very popular. You learn about another custom that now feels hilariously naive. In some regions, women preferred to confess to female confessors. Yes, they existed, particularly when the subject was anatomical. These nuns, often older and stricter, were known for being less scandalized and more clinical. One nun, Sister Marta, was famous for assigning penance based on how embarrassed the sinner looked while describing the act. The more blushing, the longer the fast. Still, not everyone walked away feeling forgiven. You pass a man kneeling at a side altar, repeating a phrase over and over, beads clutched so tightly they leave dents in his fingers. He confessed something, and now he's trying to forget it again. The repetition doesn't look peaceful. It looks like a desperate erasure. And here's your quirky fringe fact for the night. In some towns, a person who confessed to particularly scandalous acts, bestiality, for example, was made to perform their penance publicly, often carrying an enormous wax candle larger than themselves through town while reciting scripture. Because nothing says spiritual renewal like being a walking fire hazard. You find yourself lingering by the baptismal font, staring at the shallow water that reflects the ceiling like a memory trying to float. So many secrets have passed through this space. Whispers, regrets, half-truths and full denials. Not all sins were punished equally, of course. A woman who admitted to fantasizing about a priest might be sentenced to days of fasting and cold baths. The priest who returned the favor, probably just reminded to keep the curtain drawn, and not every confession ended in resolution. In one recorded case, a man confessed to laying with a nun. The priest, perhaps recognizing the name, absolved him, and then went straight to the convent and confronted the sister. She denied everything. He insisted. She pointed out that he had taken a vow of confidentiality. The situation ended in awkward silence and a redirected sermon about modesty that everyone understood a little too well. The church wanted purity, but it also wanted knowledge, and confession, for better or worse, gave them both, sort of. As you walk out into the sunlight, the wooden door thudding gently behind you, you realize something. These booths weren't built just to contain shame. They were built to translate it, to make sense of the squirming, unpredictable mess of human desire. Sometimes it worked. People walked away lighter. Sometimes it didn't. They walked away quieter. And sometimes the priest behind the screen had sins of his own, whispered to an older priest, who nodded, took notes, and added a tick mark to a long list labelled "Flesh Stronger Than Soul," because no matter how many rosaries are said, or how many rules are recited, the human heart keeps whispering things no confessional can quite catch. The smell hits you as you round the corner from the chapel path into the square, sharper than incense, riper than a Sunday feast left too long in the sun. Not the comforting rot of overripe apples or the familiar sting of butcher's salt, but something altogether more judgmental. It's the aroma of cabbage that has crossed a moral line. You trudge into the village square, and there they are, a modest crowd, half excited, half morally superior, and all carrying some form of squishy produce. At the centre, framed by timbered shops and a tilted sign for a tavern called the Saint's Elbow, stand two wooden stocks, recently oiled, ominously empty. But not for long. The bell rings. The crowd parts, and down the path comes today's guest of dishonour, a baker's daughter with her hair unpinned and her expression somewhere between sheepish and I regret nothing. Her dress is patched, her eyes defiant, and her crime, so everyone whispers, was loving not one, but two of the Reeves' sons, alternately or simultaneously. Historians still argue whether they overlapped, but the Cabbage Brigade has already made up its mind. She is guided, more like escorted, by two elders with the solemnity of judges and the coordination of people who once tripped on a rosary. They help her into the stocks, fasten the wooden brace around her neck and wrists, and step back like they've just placed a roast in the oven. And now the real ritual begins. You stand with the crowd as the vegetables fly. Not hard, not to hurt. Well, not much. It's more ceremonial disappointment, a kind of community theatre meant to publicly scrub someone's shame with airborne radishes. A turnip thuds against the post. Someone snickers. A child throws a pear that may once have been edible but now resembles regret. From somewhere to your left, a flute begins to play. Badly. And that's when you realise this isn't just a punishment, it's entertainment. Welcome to medieval public shaming, where justice meets social bonding and half the town gets to pretend they're morally superior for one whole afternoon. You observe as someone throws an onion and another person starts composing a chant. Not a mean one, more of a folk tune with judgmental undertones. The baker's daughter remains still, but you notice a smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. This isn't her first rodeo, and here comes another mainstream historical fact. Stocks and pillories were not just for theft or blasphemy. They were frequently used for moral infractions. Adultery, fornication, lewd speech, and general disorderly conduct. A flexible term that covered everything from public drunkenness to aggressive winking. Men and women alike were subject to it, though, predictably, women caught in romantic entanglements were more likely to be shamed visibly, while men might receive a fine, a handshake, or a boys will be boys sermon from someone with wine breath. Your quirky tidbit for the day. In some towns, people didn't just throw vegetables, they recited customized poems about the offender's misdeeds, bad ones, rhyming wench with stench and sin with bin. It was humiliation with a literary flair, which somehow made it worse. You walk to the edge of the crowd, where a toothless woman is selling cider and roasted chestnuts, because nothing compliments public degradation like light refreshments. She tells you today's shaming was rescheduled from yesterday due to rain. Can't have soggy stocks, she says, as if you'd questioned it. And here's the philosophical layer that creeps in while someone's throwing celery. These rituals weren't just about enforcing the rules. They were about reaffirming them in public, putting a face, red, tomato splattered, on what happens when desire becomes visible. Because the rules weren't actually about desire. They were about containment and spectacle. The church taught that sin had to be confessed, but the village preferred a more visual approach. Everyone needed to see the fall from grace, not because they wanted fewer sinners, but because they needed the reassurance that, at least today, it wasn't them in the brace. Historians still argue whether these events were genuinely moral deterrents or just highly choreographed gossip festivals. Some claim they were effective at regulating behaviour. Others suggest they simply created a temporary scapegoat, giving everyone else permission to continue their quiet transgressions, confident in the knowledge that public shame had a rotating schedule. Back in the square, the music changes, the flutist has been joined by someone with a hand drum. Rhythm enters the equation, a boy begins clapping. The baker's daughter adjusts her posture and raises her chin. A lettuce leaf hits her cheek like a limp blessing. She smiles. This is no longer about punishment. This is theatre, ritualized humiliation turned pageant. With turnips for confetti, you learn that in some towns, people paid to stand in the stocks for someone else. Hired shame-bearers, professional scapegoats. It was rare, but not unheard of, especially when reputations were fragile and cabbages were hard. You wonder, briefly, whether public shame ever worked the way it was intended, whether anyone left the square truly penitent, or if, more often, they left sticky, bruised, and weirdly popular for the next few weeks. Because let's be honest, people remember scandal, especially when it's set to music. Not all cases were funny, though. You hear about Marjorie of Kent, whose punishment for bearing a child out of wedlock was a day in the pillory, followed by a month of wearing a white hood in public labelled fornicator. And yes, the label was embroidered, which means someone took the time to stitch it. Probably someone's aunt, humming a hymn. There's also Thomas the Tanner, caught with the wife of a travelling peddler. He was not only shamed, but required to sweep the church steps every morning for 6 months while reciting the Lord's Prayer, loudly, backward. Whether this was spiritually rehabilitative or just really annoying depends on your tolerance for backwards Latin. You sit on the edge of the well and watch as the baker's daughter is finally released. The elders unlock the brace, and she stands slowly, rubbing her wrists. The crowd cheers. Genuinely, a few people clap. Someone offers her a piece of apple. She accepts. And just like that, the ritual is over. She walks away with cabbage in her hair and an undeniable strut in her step. You hear someone mutter, "She'll be back," but the way she turns the corner, straight-backed, smiling. You're not so sure. You ask an older man what the next public shame day is scheduled for. He shrugs. Depends who misbehaves, he says, or gets caught. Then he winks. Because that's the unsaid truth. The system runs on visibility, not virtue. You glance back at the stocks, now empty, gently creaking in the wind like they're trying to remember all the necks that once rested there. And for a moment, you wonder how much of morality is genuine, and how much is just a performance you stage to avoid the tomatoes. The flutist starts up again, off-key, loud. The crowd groans and disperses. You move on. You've barely shaken the last cabbage leaf out of your hood when someone grabs your elbow and whispers, "You'd best come quick. She's had another visit." You don't ask who she is, or what sort of visit they mean, because at this point in the medieval tour, you've learned not to expect normal explanations, and you're right not to. You follow them through narrow alleys, past shuttered windows and doorways that smell of salt, damp wool, and suspicion. You arrive at a small cottage pressed crookedly into the wall of the town's edge. Smoke curls from the chimney like a guilty thought. A few neighbours linger nearby, pretending to sweep or pray or check their chickens for signs of devilry. Inside, the woman, mid-40s, soft-eyed, with hands like overworked bread, is sitting on a low stool. She looks embarrassed but not afraid. Not anymore. She's been through this before, twice, and tonight, apparently, the dead husband came back, not as a ghost, not with chains and moaning. No, He came in a dream, she says, sat on the edge of her bed, touched her cheek, whispered something she won't repeat, kissed her throat, and left her with a mark. She says it quietly, eyes fixed on the fire, but the room hears it like a scream. One of the village priests, new, nervous, and visibly regretting his vows, clears his throat. Did the mark appear before or after you woke? She shrugs. I was half asleep. Maybe both. And that's when someone says the word demon. Not metaphorically. Not like, wow, what a demon of a headache. No, a literal, infernal, sulfur-breathing, soul-stealing agent of Satan, who apparently has enough spare time to impersonate deceased spouses and leave hickeys. You step back. Not from fear, but because you sense the avalanche of paperwork this is about to cause. See? In the medieval worldview, sleep wasn't just rest. It was vulnerable territory. Dreams were where the divine and the demonic could enter. If a woman dreamed of desire and woke with signs of it, it wasn't just guilt, it might be evidence. And if she claimed the visitor wore a familiar face, that made it worse. Because demons could shapeshift. They called them incubi, male demons who seduced women at night, slipped through walls, took the form of husbands, lovers, travelling minstrels. Whatever worked, their female counterparts, succubi, were blamed for seducing men in dreams, often while hovering above their beds like judgmental mistresses. But in this particular cottage, it's not the theology that's the problem, it's the mark. A dark bruise just beneath her ear, already the subject of 8 whispered theories and 1 half-composed folk ballad. The priest asks to examine it. She agrees, barely rolling her eyes, and turns her head. He inspects, squints, crosses himself, then calls for a midwife to check for further evidence. She groans. The midwife groans louder. You learn, with growing discomfort, that medieval demonology included procedures for identifying supernatural interference. These included checking for unusual body temperature, erratic pulse, and, brace yourself, bite marks shaped like inverted scripture. You don't know what that means. Neither did most of the priests, but it sounded very official. Here's another interesting historical fact of the night. Demonic seduction was taken seriously enough to make it into official doctrine. Multiple theologians, including one particularly enthusiastic inquisitor named Heinrich, compiled extensive manuals on how to detect and handle cases of night visitations. These guides included recommended prayers, interrogation techniques, and the occasional suggestion to sprinkle holy water on the bedposts. You stare at the woman again. She's calm, too calm, perhaps, and that's suspicious. Because here's the paradox. If you were too shaken, you might be hiding guilt. But if you weren't shaken enough, maybe you liked the visitation, which was even worse. Medieval logic in action. Someone in the corner mutters that she once danced during Lent. Someone else remembers that she used to brew her own herbal teas. And someone very confidently claims to have seen her talking to a black cat who definitely wasn't from the village. The case builds itself. And now for your quirky fringe detail. In some towns, people were instructed to sleep with a crucifix under their pillow to ward off spiritual intrusions. If they still had dreams of temptation, the theory was that the demon had found a loophole, possibly through the mattress. This led to an entire genre of spiritual commentary on the morality of linens. You step outside while they deliberate. A small crowd has gathered, as they always do. No vegetables this time, just worried looks and whispered math, calculating whether they're next. And here comes the open scholarly debate. Was the hysteria around demonic seduction a reflection of genuine belief, or a convenient explanation for dreams, desire, and guilt in a repressive society? Some scholars argue people truly feared night demons. Others say it was a way to process forbidden longing without owning it. After all, it wasn't me, it was Satan, is a tidy exit from a very complicated conversation with your own subconscious. You return to the cottage to find the priest reciting a cleansing prayer. The woman joins in, dutiful but half-hearted, like someone reciting a poem she memorized out of politeness. The mark, she says, is fading already. And this makes everyone more suspicious. You learn that sometimes these visitations were not punished, but exorcised. The logic being, if it was involuntary, it's not sin, it's affliction. But if it happened twice, that's a pattern. 3 times, now you're on a list. In especially charged cases, women accused of repeated demonic visitations were tried as witches, especially if there were other red flags in their lifestyle. Midwifery, herbal knowledge, childlessness, outspokenness, or an inconveniently located birthmark. The more eccentric your personality, the closer you were to becoming community folklore. One woman in Brittany was accused of consorting with a demon because she laughed too loudly at a saint's procession. Her defense: the incense was making me sneeze. Verdict: suspicious. The woman in front of you now, still brushing ashes from her skirt, seems mostly tired. Tired of being questioned. Tired of being watched. Tired of pretending her dreams aren't hers. And just as you think she might finally be left in peace, the priest asks her one last question. Did you feel pleasure? The room goes still. The fire cracks once. Dramatically. She doesn't answer, which means she just said more than any confession could. You leave quietly, before they start inspecting her pillows for signs of possession. Outside, the wind picks up. Tugging at the hem of your cloak, you glance at the moon, full and indifferent, and you realize something uncomfortably timeless. Whenever society doesn't understand a woman's desire, especially if it doesn't fit the script, they blame something outside her. A devil, a spell, a shadow slipping in through the window, anything but her own hunger. You walk on. Behind you, the door shuts with a sigh. The bruise fades. The story stays. You step into the museum expecting dust, silence, and a slightly passive-aggressive docent. Instead, you're greeted by the unmistakable clank of iron. There it is, glinting under a spotlight behind thick glass. An artifact equal parts myth, meme, and medieval metalwork. The chastity belt. It looks like a cross between a torture device and a very bad idea. A thick band of iron loops around where dignity used to live, connected by rivets, bolts, and, uncomfortably, a tiny, keyhole-sized padlock. The display plaque describes it with academic restraint. But let's be honest, you're staring at what might be the most aggressively symbolic undergarment in Western history. Was it real? Was it used? Was it itchy? Historians still argue whether chastity belts were common practice or historical exaggeration. Some say they were propaganda, metal metaphors, if you will. Others claim they were actually worn, at least for short periods, usually by noble women left behind when husbands went off to war. You find yourself squinting at the contraption and wondering if any woman ever made it more than 5 minutes before faking a lock malfunction just to escape. The legend is simple. A jealous husband, usually a knight, locks up his wife's body before heading off to war or pilgrimage or some other heroic detour. The key, safely around his neck. The message, fidelity or fracture. But reality, as usual, has more rust and nuance. First, let's talk logistics. Iron doesn't breathe. Medieval hygiene already struggled with, let's call them maintenance routines, and adding a sealed-off pelvic grill to the equation seems less like a fidelity strategy and more like a yeast-accelerated death wish. You imagine trying to ride a horse or, heaven help us, squat in a field while wearing 20 pounds of what is essentially locksmith cosplay, and you start to wonder, who exactly thought this was a good idea? The museum suggests these were used symbolically. You suspect that's curatorial code for please stop asking if this was real. Still, some documents mention belts, or at least locks. One French poem jokes about a jealous man buying a gilded girdle with no opening. Another Italian tale describes a merchant who left a sealed pouch on his wife. Not iron, but canvas reinforced with faith and hope. That last part may be poetic license, but the actual iron models you see in museums today, many of them date not from the 1100s, but the 1800s, when the Victorians developed a deep, if repressed, fascination with the Middle Ages. And let's be honest, if anyone was going to invent a chastity belt retroactively, it would be a society that thought showing ankles was a moral hazard. Which brings us to the real question. If chastity belts weren't widely used, why do we keep bringing them up? Because they're perfectly engineered cultural anxiety objects. Whether you view them as instruments of oppression, elaborate jokes, or early examples of overprotective parenting, they sit at the crossroads of obsession, female sexuality, control, and the fear of what women might do when men aren't watching. Some claim they were never meant for women at all. That's your quirky historical tidbit for the day. There were male chastity belts. 2, less publicized, more elaborate. 1, supposedly designed for traveling monks, included spikes. You assume the monk didn't walk far. One theory says these devices were actually anti-masturbation tools during the Victorian era, part of a broader medical movement that believed self-pleasure led to blindness. madness, and poor penmanship, only one of which is supported by evidence, and even then, only if you're writing while walking. So now you're standing in front of this museum case, staring at what may be a complete fiction with excellent metalwork, and trying to untangle centuries of myth, shame, and a disturbing willingness to weld things near soft tissue. You imagine the conversation. "Darling, I'm off to Jerusalem. I'll be gone 3 years. I've had something made for you." "Oh, a necklace." Not exactly. And yet, even if the device itself wasn't real, or at least not widely used, the idea of it was, the concept lingered in poems, sermons, jokes, and morality tales. It was the ultimate threat disguised as virtue. We trust you, but not really. And that says more about power dynamics than actual chastity. Because let's be honest, trust in medieval marriages was rarely about emotional intimacy. It was about property, heirs, and reputation. If a nobleman returned from crusade to find his wife with a child that looked suspiciously like the stable boy, it wasn't just scandal, it was legal disaster. Inheritance was at stake. So a chastity belt, real or imagined, became a symbol of control, a way to outsource worry. But here's where it gets philosophical. What kind of love requires a lock? If you trust someone, you don't need metal. If you don't trust them, metal won't help. The whole thing collapses under its own irony, like building a wall around your garden and then handing out flyers that say, "Definitely no strawberries in here." Some scholars argue that chastity belts weren't ever about real women at all. They were part of male fantasy, a way for storytellers and moralists to reinforce the ideal of the pure woman, untouched and loyal, no matter how long the hero was off dragon slaying or tax collecting. It wasn't about what women were doing. It was about what men were afraid they might, and that fear, it echoed loudly. You come across a satirical woodcut, German, 16th century, showing a blacksmith fitting a woman for a belt while she rolls her eyes and the neighbour looks on with a smirk. The caption, "Something about a tight soul makes for a faithful wife." The joke is clear. Even then, people understood the absurdity. You picture the woman from the engraving, going home, putting the belt on a mannequin, and heading to the tavern. That's the thing. Even when they tried to engineer chastity, they underestimated cleverness. Locks can be picked, keys can be copied, and bolts, as any disgruntled locksmith will tell you, can rust, which brings you to the quiet truth. The belt was never really about women. It was about men trying to control time, distance, and uncertainty with hardware. As you step away from the glass, your reflection follows you for a moment, warped by the curve of the metal. It's a strange feeling, to stand so close to something so symbolic, so controversial, and yet so possibly entirely made up. You can't help but imagine some modern curator staring at this artifact and thinking, do I label it restraint device, mythic symbol, or early cosplay? Maybe it's all three. Outside, the sky is beginning to dim, the late afternoon casting long shadows through the stained windows. You walk past a display of coins, old armour, a few daggers, and one slightly unenthusiastic stuffed falcon. But nothing sticks with you quite like that belt, not because of its shape or its implications, but because it reminds you how far people will go to preserve a story, especially one about control, and perhaps, just perhaps, how even iron can't contain something as inconvenient as desire. You were promised a wedding. What you got was a procession of half-drunken strangers hauling embroidered linens into a bedroom while a lute player trailed behind them, plucking the world's least seductive tune in G minor. The vows are done. The feast has been devoured. There was stew, ale, and a disturbing number of eel pies. And now, with the sun slipping behind the crooked rooftops and the last of the wine staining everyone's teeth, a royal shade of regret. It's time for the part no one really talks about in fairy tales. The bedding. You trudge along with the rest of the guests as they follow the newlyweds to their sleeping quarters, a room that's been scrubbed within an inch of its life and perfumed with enough lavender to hide at least 3 different kinds of nerves. Someone shouts a rhyme that involves the words bliss and kiss, and something that definitely rhymed with thrust. No one blinks. The bride is blushing, or flushed, or overwhelmed by the weight of approximately 30 people carrying torches and singing about her virtue. The groom looks like he's either about to ascend to heaven or throw up, possibly both. This isn't a private moment. This is theatre. This is law. This is custom. In many parts of medieval Europe, it wasn't enough to get married. You had to be seen beginning the marriage, witnessed, documented. often by people who had no business being that close to any mattress that wasn't their own. The goal, legitimacy, a marriage wasn't truly binding until it had been consummated, and you couldn't consummate unless someone could certify that the couple had at least attempted to touch toes under the covers. You step inside the room as the final verse of a drinking song fades into heavy silence. The bed is large, heavily carved, and drowning in floral embroidery. Candles flicker at every corner. The air smells of roses, wood smoke, and freshly washed fear. The couple is ushered forward. Yes, ushered, as in guided to the bed by relatives and friends who murmur blessings and adjustments. The bride's veil is lifted, her shoes removed, the groom's doublet unbuttoned by a cousin with a little too much enthusiasm. You shift uncomfortably, wondering if anyone's going to suggest charades while they're at it. Someone sets down a goblet of spiced wine near the bed. Someone else fluffs the pillows with the gravity of a high priest preparing a sacrifice. A nearby grandmother sprinkles something that might be dried rosemary across the mattress and mutters something that might be Latin, or just farming advice. Here's your historical fact. In many medieval cultures, the bedding ceremony was a legally and socially recognized event. Not just symbolic, it was documentation. Witnesses would literally sign off the next day that the couple had gone to bed together, and sometimes, more disturbingly, that the process had begun with sound intent. Some courts required proof, a nightshirt, a sheet, even an eyewitness account. That's right, some poor soul, usually a priest or a noble elder, might stand behind a curtain to confirm that physical contact occurred, and you thought your in-laws were invasive. And now, your quirky tidbit. In certain Scottish traditions, guests would slap the groom on the back and the bride on the foot, shouting "Speed the plough," as the couple climbed into bed. It was unclear whether this was agricultural metaphor or just the worst cheerleading routine in human history. Back in the room, the couple sits on the edge of the bed. Everyone's watching. The lute player plucks out a soft tune now, something wistful, probably about lost innocence. You hear a whispered bet about how long they'll last. Someone starts passing around honey cakes. Someone else asks if this counts toward their penance. You begin to feel sorry for the furniture. And then, finally, mercifully, the priest nods. The formal blessings are complete. The bride leans forward, kisses the groom on the cheek, and the crowd begins to file out, slowly, like reluctant theatre-goers after a particularly tense performance. A few people linger, pretending to look for dropped handkerchiefs. One man leaves backwards, for luck. The mother-in-law, however, does not move. She stands there, arms folded, looking at her son as if she could will him into bravery with sheer maternal force. The bride doesn't meet her gaze. She's too busy adjusting the bedsheet into what might be a defensive structure. You wait. You wait too long. And finally, the mother-in-law turns and walks out without a word, leaving behind a silence so thick you feel guilty by association. Historians still argue whether bedding ceremonies were truly universal or only practiced among nobility in certain regions. Some argue they were theatrical remnants of tribal rites. Others suggest they were public contracts cloaked in ritual. But everyone agrees on one thing. They were awkward as hell, and yet effective. These ceremonies weren't about romance. They were about accountability. In a world where inheritance, legitimacy, and family alliances were as binding as papal decrees, you needed witnesses. People needed to know the marriage had begun. Whether it continued successfully, that was less their concern. You hear tales of couples who faked the bedding, lying side by side in silence until the crowd cleared and then going right back to their original bedrooms. Others leaned into the performance, even making jokes to ease the tension. One noble couple reportedly threw rose petals at the guests as they left and locked the door with a flourish. They later divorced, not because of lack of passion, but because someone insulted her embroidery. There's also the infamous tale of a duke who was so nervous. He asked his brother to take his place under the covers while he stood outside and listened. The bride noticed. She was not pleased. Neither was the Pope. As you exit the room, the candles flickering behind you. You pass a servant girl smirking as she carries away the wine. She mutters something about finally getting to sleep, and you realise this wasn't the first wedding she's witnessed from that corner. Outside, the evening air is cooler. The stars have returned, unimpressed. The laughter from the feast hall continues, quieter now. The lute has stopped. You can still hear the faint creak of the bed inside. Maybe it's love. Maybe it's exhaustion. Maybe someone sat on the wrong side and broke the leg. Whatever it is, The moment is theirs now, and you, along with half the village, the priest, the bard, and a mother-in-law with psychic daggers, have played your part, because in the medieval world, love wasn't just a feeling, it was a contract, a ritual, a group activity. Nothing says intimacy like 40 people judging your pillow arrangement, and as you wander back toward your cot for the night, you can't help but think, there's something strangely reassuring about a society that trusts love so little. It literally demands witnesses, not romantic, but thorough. You squeeze onto the narrow wooden bench and brace yourself. The stone walls around you are damp with centuries of silent judgment. The church is full, mostly peasants, a few nobles near the front, and one extremely self-satisfied rooster perched just outside the window. The air smells like candle wax, mildew, and old incense that's been burned so many times it started to smell less like holiness and more like mild regret. The priest climbs into the pulpit, and you just know, this is not going to be about hope. He's red in the face already, which is impressive considering he hasn't even started. A good sign, if your definition of good includes shouting about eternal damnation before lunch. Brothers and sisters, he begins, voice booming like thunder in a particularly unforgiving cloud. The body is a vessel, and pleasure is the leak. You blink. That was fast. He continues, rattling off a list of banned behaviours, none of which anyone in the pews has ever seen written down, and most of which you're pretty sure he made up in the bath last night. But everyone nods, because in the medieval world, lust was not just a sin. It was a structural flaw, an architectural weakness of the soul, and like all dangerous cracks, it had to be patched, usually with guilt, and sermons, and the occasional accidental Latin pun. You learn that there are, officially, 30 forbidden sexual positions. 30. All lovingly detailed in ecclesiastical manuals compiled by monks who, we can assume, had a great deal of time and a slightly disturbing imagination. These include things like standing, facing the wrong direction, and with joy, only one was fully permitted. Missionary, of course, preferably in silence, in darkness, on a Tuesday, and definitely not during Advent. Because here comes your historical fact. The church calendar had over 150 sexually restricted days. That included major feast days, the day before a feast day, Fridays because penance, Lent, Advent, and, depending on your local priest, Wednesdays, Sundays, and days that just felt suspicious. Married couples were often left with something like 8 to 10 acceptable days a year, fewer if the bishop was in a mood, and you thought your schedule was tight. The priest rants on, now fully warmed up. His favourite words seem to be fire, temptation, and the writhing pit of the condemned. At one point, he waves a hand dramatically and nearly knocks over a candlestick. No one flinches. They've seen this sermon before. You glance to your right. A woman with 3 children is nodding serenely. To your left, an old man is asleep with his mouth open, drooling slightly onto his walking stick. Somehow, both reactions feel appropriate. The priest declares that even within marriage, pleasure is dangerous, that the act is sanctified only when done with spiritual focus and reproductive intent, which sounds inspiring. There's a soft rustle behind you. Someone drops a rosary. Someone else quietly giggles and is immediately elbowed by a grandmother with the force of a small ox. You're told, firmly, that even thoughts can lead to sin, that dreams are invitations for demons, that laughing too freely can soften the moral fibre, and that couples who grin during union are opening the door to heresy, which, frankly, explains a lot about the paintings in the hallway. And now for your quirky tidbit. In some regions, priests encourage couples to say prayers during the act, out loud, in unison. There's even one record of a rural French priest assigning Our Fathers to be recited with every movement. Interpret that however you like. The couple certainly did. The real kicker is the seriousness with which all of this is delivered. This isn't comedy. This is doctrine. For centuries, theologians pored over scriptures and debated whether pleasure was a byproduct of the fall, a test of obedience, or a necessary evil barely tolerated by divine patience. Theologians like St. Jerome called the body a sack of dung, and warned that even married love could be a slippery slope to sin. Augustine, bless him, believed original sin itself was passed down via lustful conception, which means every baby ever born, in his eyes, came with a whisper of unholy joy baked into its first cry, Historians still argue whether this intense anxiety about pleasure came from a genuine spiritual crisis or a more bureaucratic fear of losing control. Because let's face it, if people start thinking their bodies are holy, or worse, fun, then obedience becomes a lot harder to enforce. The sermon shifts gears. Now it's about modesty, specifically the dangers of necklines, dancing, and hair left unbraided in public. The priest warns that Satan lives not just in actions, but in fabrics. He scowls directly at a teenage girl who immediately pulls her hood up like she's entering a monastery. You're tempted to laugh, but then he pulls out a hell tapestry, one of those intricately woven doomsday scenes that shows lustful sinners being boiled, skewered, or spanked by red creatures with excellent abs. It's all very dramatic, very vivid, very effective, if your goal is to ruin breakfast for the next week. There's even a depiction of a man being chased by a woman whose only sin, apparently, was having opinions and thighs. She is clearly the villain. You try to remember when religion became less about transcendence and more about regulating knees. Then the priest circles back to jokes, specifically that jokes are not to be told during or immediately after the act of marriage, that laughter invites the devil, that a husband who chuckles too soon may wake to find his wife replaced with a succubus, which, to be fair, sounds like a fantastic plot twist. And here's your open scholarly debate. Did medieval people actually follow these rules? Or were the sermons more about setting the ideal than reflecting reality? Some argue that peasants ignored most of it and went about their business with a shrug. Others believe the fear seeped in regardless, shaping behaviour not through enforcement, but through repetition. Because when you hear the same message every week, in every prayer, etched in every stained glass window, whispered by every neighbour, it sticks. Even if you're not sure you believe it, you begin to fear it. And so you sit, hour after hour, through warnings about flames and desire and how every cough during Lent might be a sign of inner corruption. You watch the priest sweat through his robes. You hear the word sin so many times it starts to lose shape. You think of how many generations grew up believing pleasure was a trap, joy was suspicious, and the safest form of love was the one done quickly, quietly, and with an apology at the end. And just as the sermon seems to be winding down, the priest adds one more item. No intimacy on feast days dedicated to female saints, because apparently they're watching outside. The bells toll, the rooster crows again, everyone stands for the final hymn, which includes the word purge 4 times. You exit the church with the rest of the congregation, blinking into daylight like prisoners released from a particularly vivid lecture. Someone mutters, "Same sermon, different week." Another replies, "He left out the one about swans again." You don't ask. The crowd disperses, the teenagers giggle, the elders sigh, and somewhere, behind the pulpit, the priest wipes his brow and begins planning next Sunday's fire-themed oration. You walk slowly, wondering how a faith so full of mystery and transcendence ended up so deeply concerned with positioning and calendar math. But then again, maybe that's the point. Keep people tangled in shame, and they'll never notice the stars. You wander into the scriptorium expecting silence and ink. What you find is a monk hunched over a parchment, his quill moving slowly, deliberately, like someone sketching a memory he's not supposed to keep. The candle beside him flickers, casting long shadows over the margin of the page. And there, right along the edge, tucked between theological reflections on the nature of divine mercy, is a poem, a short one, 6 lines, written in Latin so tenderly it almost blushes off the page. It's about another monk. No names, just descriptions, a certain laugh, a gesture during Vespers, the way his voice sounded on cold mornings. You read it twice before realizing it's not about friendship. It's not about virtue. It's about longing. You've just met same-sex love in the Middle Ages, not paraded, not praised, but scribbled into the margins and whispered through centuries, because in a world built on structure and silence, love still found its way in. It just had to get creative. You sit quietly, flipping through pages of psalms and penitence, and you begin to notice the pattern. Letters between monks that linger too long on physical description, prayers that read more like confessions of affection than of sin, entire treatises on brotherhood that seem, shall we say, emotionally committed. The language of love is present, it's just coded. Here's your another historical fact. Monasteries were some of the only places in medieval Europe where men lived in close, intimate, all-male communities, often for life. They worked, prayed ate, and slept in proximity. Emotional bonds were inevitable. Deep ones, affectionate ones, and sometimes ones that edge past the invisible line the church didn't want to name. One monk writes that his companion is my mirror and my morning. Another describes the burning ache when his fingers brush mine. And yet, in every case, the writing twists back, redirects itself toward God, cloaks the feeling in spiritual devotion, or buries it under a psalm. Historians still argue whether these letters reflected romantic love, platonic intensity, or something in between, a medieval form of emotional mysticism with footnotes. But the yearning is there. The ambiguity doesn't weaken it, it sharpens it. And it wasn't just monks. You step into a convent courtyard at dusk, the orange light bouncing off the stone walls like a last-minute apology. You overhear two nuns reciting lines from Hildegard of Bingen, that mystical visionary who also wrote music, medicine, and possibly the earliest lesbian subtext in Western hymnals. One of the sisters corrects the other's pronunciation, gently, but with that particular tone reserved for people you secretly adore and officially must never touch. In some convents, nuns form deep spiritual friendships, formalized as sister bonds or special companionships. These were celebrated, even encouraged, up to a point. They exchanged letters, shared private prayers, sometimes beds, occasionally tombs. One pair requested to be buried side by side, holding hands in the fresco. The abbot approved, after crossing out the original epitaph, joined in love. He replaced it with united in Christ. Close enough. And now for your quirky tidbit. In 14th century London, two men were fined for hugging too affectionately in public. Not for anything overt, just for embracing in a way a local official described as lingering beyond comfort. You imagine that moment, two men, perhaps drunk on festival wine or just on each other, holding 1 second too long. That's all it took. You pass a market wall plastered with faded proclamations, laws against fornication, heresy, theft. Somewhere near the bottom, men may not lie with men as with women. Sure, sharp, final. But then again, so is gravity, and people still trip over it. The laws were clear. The punishments range from fines to flogging to execution, depending on the region, the century, and the judge's mood. But enforcement, wildly inconsistent. In some towns, same-sex relationships were treated as sins, like gluttony or pride, serious, but fixable with confession and prayer. In others, especially under stricter regimes, such relationships were criminalized as acts against nature, punishable by death, often carried out quietly, symbolically, or not at all. And yet, love persisted, often in plain sight. A knight is buried with another knight. Their tombs are intertwined. One inscription reads, "He loved him more than any brother." Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was more. We'll never know. But someone carved that phrase in stone. Back in the scriptorium, the monk has left. His parchment is still drying, the ink curling at the edges. You lean in. The last line of the poem reads, "If love be sin, let God forgive the moonlight." You can't decide if it's beautiful or heartbreaking. It's probably both. You walk through the cloisters, feet echoing off the cold tiles, and think about how much emotion never made it into the official records. How many letters were burned? How many names were never written? How many fingers grazed in candlelit silence and then pulled away, quickly, guiltily, before someone noticed? And yet, the traces remained. You come across a medieval play, one of those morality dramas the church loved to produce for the peasants. In it, two male characters share a bond so intense, so loyal, it overshadows every other plotline. When one dies, the other weeps, not just weepeth for his brother, but tears his clothes, curses the heavens, and refuses to eat for a week. The crowd probably nodded and said, "Ah yes, brotherhood." But you read it and think, no one grieves that hard over someone they just shared a rake with. Historians still debate whether medieval people had a concept of sexual orientation the way we do now. Some argue it didn't exist, that relationships were seen as acts, not identities. Others believe that orientation existed, but it lived underground, unnamed and unwelcome, like a flower pressed into a book you're not supposed to open. And yet, there it is, in the poems, in the margins, in the music written in unusual keys, in the way one monk signs his name beside another's. Even when the page is meant for prayer, you find a parchment that simply reads, "He is my silence when words betray me." No attribution, No context, just emotion, preserved like dried wax. You realize something strange. Despite everything, laws, doctrine, sermons, shame, these people found ways to love, not loudly, not freely, but stubbornly, because love, as it turns out, is inconveniently persistent, especially when no one wants it to exist. You step outside. The evening wind slipping past you like a ghost who remembers. The convent bells ring. Somewhere, someone sings a hymn just slightly off key, and you walk on, thinking not about who was allowed to love, but about who refused to stop. You follow the alley not out of curiosity, but because the baker's boy said something about hot stew, loud music, and a place where the wine never runs out unless the mayor's already been by. The cobblestones are slick with last night's rain and this morning's spilled ale. A lute twangs from a window. You round the corner expecting sin. What you find is a ledger, and a woman behind it. She's older, sharp-eyed, and wearing a dress more practical than provocative. Rings on 3 fingers, ink under her nails. She does not greet you with a wink. She asks if you're here for a room, a drink, or a reckoning. You say just passing through. She nods and returns to her numbers. This is the brothel, or, more precisely, the legal brothel, established, taxed, church approved, if not in spirit, then definitely in silver. You glance around and realize it's not the den of wickedness you were promised in last week's sermon. There's laughter, yes, perfume in the air, but also structure, rotas, rules. One girl is mending a sleeve by candlelight. Another is feeding soup to a limping knight who's trying not to cry into his potatoes. The walls are decorated, not with lewd tapestries, but with municipal certificates. Licensed House of Hospitality, one reads. Another, dated and signed by the bishop's scribe, details the allowable hours of operation and the fines for rowdy behaviour. Welcome to the sanctioned vice district. And no, it's not hidden in the shadows. It's directly next to the chapel. Because why keep temptation far away when you can regulate it, tax it, and stroll past it on your way to Vespers? The madam, it turns out, knows this better than anyone. She flips through her ledger with the grace of a woman who has balanced pleasure and policy longer than most men have held a sword. She knows how many girls are working tonight, how many candles she needs to replace, how many florins to send the bishop so he doesn't suddenly rediscover his outrage. Here is another weird historical fact tonight. Medieval towns across Europe, including London, Avignon, and Florence, often operated licensed brothels, sometimes run by the city itself. The logic, better to keep sex contained in one place than let it wander, unmonitored, through respectable neighbourhoods, and if the city could make money off the containment, even better. Prostitution was labelled a necessary sin, a moral compromise for a practical world. Theologians said it was like a sewer, unpleasant, but essential. One bishop in Vienna compared brothels to storm drains, unsightly, but preventing worse floods elsewhere. You wonder what he thought about the madam who once refused to let a visiting friar in until he washed his feet. Hygiene, after all, was non-negotiable. Inside the brothel, things are surprisingly quiet. The girls chat at a long table, peeling apples and gambling with buttons. A dog sleeps under the bench. The fireplace crackles in a way that feels more like tavern than temptation. And here's your quirky fringe fact. In many towns, prostitutes were required to wear specific clothing, often yellow veils or striped belts, to distinguish them in public, but the rules were so inconsistently enforced that local markets became a patchwork of ambiguity. One woman was fined for wearing the wrong colour, then again for changing it too often. Her response, she dyed her belt plaid. The mayor gave up. In some cases, brothels paid more in taxes than blacksmiths, especially when managed efficiently. Some were even city-owned, with profits going to road repairs or, ironically, chapel renovations. And yes, the church knew. Sometimes the church managed them directly. A convent in France was once caught funding its choir repairs with a cut from a nearby brothel. When questioned, the abbess replied, "The Lord moves in mysterious, yet lucrative, ways." Historians still argue whether this level of clerical involvement was practical tolerance or quiet hypocrisy. Some defend it as damage control, others condemn it as moral laundering. But either way, the arrangement stuck. You spot a young man at the door, hesitating. He holds a coin and a daisy. The madame sees him and sighs. Third time this week, she says, and waves one of the girls forward. The girl rolls her eyes fondly and takes the flower. "He just wants to talk," she whispers. Then he cries about his ex and overpays. You ask if this is common. She laughs. You think it's all moaning in candlelight? Most nights it's just soup, tears, and foot rubs. The madam returns to her ledger. Behind her, someone starts tuning a harp, a real one. Someone else throws dice in the corner. The fireplace hisses. The dog snores. A girl reads a love poem out loud, but changes the ending because she prefers happy ones. This isn't a den of vice. It's a survival economy, and it's one that runs smoother than the town hall. In the far room, you hear singing, soft, untrained. Lovely. The words are French. Something about longing and apricots. You think about the women who live here, not just entertainers or outcasts, but often widows, orphans, runaways, women with few options and sharp wits. Some chose this, some didn't, but all of them adapted. You find a chalkboard near the door. It lists house rules: no fists, no fire inside, unless it's in the hearth, no prayers before coin, crossed out and rewritten, prayers optional, not transactional. You smile. Someone once said brothels are the oldest profession, but maybe they're just the oldest institution willing to say what everyone else pretends not to know. You walk outside. The church bells ring in the distance. Evening mass. Across the street, the chapel doors swing open and a procession of candles weaves out into the street. A priest walks past the brothel, nods politely. The madam nods back. They've probably shared taxes, and soup, and possibly a bottle of wine. You realise something strange. The church preaches purity, but profit has a louder voice. And the women inside, they've learned how to speak both languages. You're sitting in a tavern just off the market square. Half-empty mug of something brown and optimistic in front of you. When the door swings open and she walks in, not the innkeeper's daughter, not a nun lost on her way to Vespers, not some blushing bride delivering bread to her in-laws. No, this woman has authority. In her boots, in her brow, in the dagger at her belt that gleams like it's heard more confessions than any priest alive. She orders beer in a voice that could hush livestock. Two men at the table beside you scoot their benches away. Not out of fear, exactly, but in the way you do when someone walks in with a sword and a reputation. No one says her name, but they all know it. She's a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. Not in the books, not in the sermons, not in the charmingly inaccurate tapestries that hang in noble halls, showing women doing nothing more strenuous than holding fruit or crying photogenically. But she exists, and she's not alone. You begin to notice them everywhere. The mistress at the merchant's house who signs all his paperwork because he never learned to read. The widow who runs the apothecary, whose herbs are suspiciously effective and whose jars are labelled in 5 languages. The brewster. Yes, that's a female brewer, who makes the best ale in 3 counties and pays her taxes with a smirk. The embroiderer whose tapestries include subtle details like a woman sitting on a throne that definitely wasn't in the original request. You start connecting the dots. Women in medieval Europe held more economic power than many people assume, especially unmarried ones. Widows could inherit property. Brewsters dominated the beer trade in some towns. Midwives, apothecaries, and even butchers could be women, until certain guilds politely but firmly rewrote the rules to edge them out. You walk through a village where half the alehouses are run by women over 40, who no longer care what anyone thinks. Their aprons are stained. Their ledgers are immaculate. Their opinions are sharper than their knives, and their knives are very sharp. One of them, Maud, tells you her husband died 20 years ago. She didn't remarry. She kept the tavern. She grew the barley herself. When a tax collector suggested she should return to her proper role, she charged him double and told the bishop she'd seen him gambling. She hasn't had a problem since. Historians still argue whether women like Maud were exceptions or representatives of a forgotten norm. Some say they were rare, unusual blips in a system stacked against them. Others believe their stories were erased, overwritten by centuries of chroniclers who found ambitious women confusing and unpoetic. You stroll past a manor and catch a glimpse of a noble woman in armour, training with a wooden sword. Her father's away, her brother's uninterested. She figures someone should be ready when the neighbouring baron gets greedy. The steward watches her with the nervous admiration of a man who once tried to correct her, and now walks with a limp. Then there are the healers, those women who learned to read plants and bones like scripture. Some were beloved, some were feared, many were both. You meet one who crushes dried beetles into a powder she claims will inspire affection. You're not sure if it works, but her waiting room is never empty. One gives you a salve for inner restlessness. You ask what's in it. She says, mostly rosemary and a little audacity. And here's your quirky tidbit. In several medieval towns, women could earn the title of master craftswoman and train apprentices. One woman in 15th century Paris ran a successful illuminations workshop, employing 6 men and 2 women. She signed her work with a stylized rose, which, to be fair, is classier than your initials in a smiley face. Not all these women had power, though many were still boxed in by laws, customs, and ceilings, glass, wooden, or just social. But the ones who slipped through, they built parallel empires, quiet ones, sharp ones. You stumble upon a letter, written in elegant French and tucked into a ledger at the back of a scribe's collection. It's addressed from a woman to her lover. Not scandalous, not explicit, just clear. She tells him what she wants, where to meet, what he must bring, what she won't tolerate. It ends with, "If you do not come, I will take your horse and your dignity and ride both into the next village." You hope she did, and here's where it gets philosophical. Women who weren't supposed to exist usually weren't trying to rebel. They were just trying to live fully in a system that only offered fractions. A corner of the house, a paragraph in the law, a single permitted emotion, patience. So they expanded, quietly, loudly, with needles and beer mugs and careful accounting. One woman stitched tiny hidden phrases into altarcloths, a kind of subversive embroidery, messages to God, to other women, to herself. I remember, she is gone. I was here, not protest. Exactly, but presence. You see a tapestry in a noble's home that shows the lady of the manor holding a falcon. But look closely, and her hand is tied to the perch by a red thread. A joke, a metaphor, a warning. Historians aren't sure. You spend a night at the house of a merchant who made his fortune in spices. His wife manages the books. His mistress manages the shipping contracts. They both sit at the dinner table, correcting his math. He doesn't seem to mind. You meet a girl who sells candles by the monastery gate. She speaks 5 languages, learned from travellers, wants to be a scribe, laughs when you ask if she's allowed. Allowed, she says. I just haven't been stopped yet. Outside the tavern, the woman with the dagger is now playing dice with a mason and a nun. She wins. They don't argue. You don't ask how she got her reputation. You assume it involved at least one bishop, a stolen goat, and a strongly worded letter. As night falls, you realize these women didn't ask to be remembered, but they refused to be erased. They weren't saints, or always kind, or even legal, half the time, but they were real, and they carried on, thread by thread, alabi ale, rule by cleverly bent rule, and in a world built to contain them, they made space, with daggers, with beer, and sometimes with embroidery. You duck beneath a low lintel and step into the apothecary, expecting medicine. What you get is desire in powdered form. The room smells like dried thyme, spilled secrets, and something vaguely amphibian. Shelves bow under the weight of glass jars and beeswax-sealed crocks. Labels are written in a script so spidery, you half expect them to scurry off the page, and somewhere behind the curtain, something bubbles, loudly. The apothecary herself looks exactly as you'd expect. Half librarian, half forest witch, hair tied back with twine, apron stained with what could be berries or sins. She eyes you up and down with the kind of look that says, "You're here for something you're not supposed to want." She's not wrong, because tonight, you're not here for a headache tonic or a rash remedy. You're here to learn how people in the Middle Ages tried to make other people fall in love with them. Spoiler. It rarely involved charm. Instead, it involved recipes. Elaborate, strange, often questionable recipes. Crushed beetles, stolen bed linens, whispered names baked into bread. Herbs picked at midnight under a waxing moon. You flip through a codex of medieval love magic and realise half of it reads like a dinner party gone terribly wrong. One recipe includes ground stag heart, mixed with saffron and given in wine. Another suggests writing your beloved's name on your chest in goose fat before walking backward through a hedge. And yet another, perhaps the boldest, recommends that a woman take a bit of a man's personal essence, you know the one, and bake it into a spiced tart. You're not kidding. Someone in Bologna probably tried it. The apothecary pulls out a vial. "This," she says, "is dream salve." You lean closer. The smell hits you like Rosemary's moodier cousin. She explains, "Rub it on your chest before sleep. Whisper a name, and the person will appear in your dream." She does not guarantee consent or punctuality. Another historical fact: love magic was common in medieval Europe, especially among women, while men used charms to gain favour or fortune. Women turned to herbs, salves, and whispered spells to secure affection, or at least attention. Manuals survive from the 13th and 14th centuries detailing dozens of such remedies, usually sandwiched between recipes for scurvy and gout. The line between medicine and magic was porous. Yarrow used for fevers could also be tied into knots and hidden in clothing to bind the heart. Rue, which protected against plague, was also said to attract suitors when boiled with rose petals and honey. Parsley wasn't just garnish. It was a romantic accelerant. Probably not effective, but at least it freshened your breath. You ask the apothecary if people believed it worked. She shrugs. Enough to come back. Enough to pay in advance. That's the thing. Love doesn't care about logic. It cares about hope, and when you've been ignored at the Harvest Festival 4 years running, or your betrothed is more enchanted by his pigeon coop than by your poetry, you'll try anything, even wormroot. Behind you, a younger woman enters, clutching a chicken feather and looking nervous. She wants something for confidence. The apothecary hands her a small sachet. Hang it over your door and say his name when you sweep. The girl nods like she's just been handed the key to a kingdom. Maybe she has. You sit on a stool beside a stack of scrolls. One is open to a binding ritual. Not legal, emotional. It involves placing 2 wax figures near a fire while repeating a phrase 108 times. You ask if it's symbolic or literal. The apothecary says, "Depends how desperate you are." Historians still argue whether love potions were genuinely believed to be effective, or simply acted as emotional placebos. Some say they gave people confidence. Others think they functioned like early relationship counselling. Except with frogs, what's certain is that people kept making them, over and over, across centuries and cultures. And now for your quirky fringe tidbit. There's a documented potion recipe that requires you to simmer 9 toenail clippings, a rooster's left eye, and the first haircut from a baby's head. Then pour it over your beloved's doorstep at dawn. Unsurprisingly, this recipe does not appear in modern wellness blocks. Back in the shop, the apothecary brings out a bundle of embroidered cloths. At first, they seem decorative. Floral patterns, stars, birds. Then she flips one over. You see tiny, careful lettering sewn into the hem. A man's name, a date, a phrase, "Return before frost." These weren't for show. They were spells stitched in secret. Wear this near your skin, and remember me. You touch one gently. The thread is rough, but the sentiment's soft. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't always romantic. It was strategic, survival-based, transactional. But every now and then, it was also fiercely, irrationally hopeful, which explains the candle burned upside down, the salt circle in the alley, the woman who swore by dried apple cores blessed under starlight. You ask if any of it works. The apothecary smiles. Everything works, or nothing does. You realise then that half of love magic is just attention with incense. A way to say, "I'm trying. I'm willing to kneel beside a boiling pot of regret and parsley if it means you might notice me." Outside, the sun has set. The sky is ink-stained and humming with crickets. You thank the apothecary. She hands you a small jar with no label. "For sleep," she says. Or dreaming. Depends who you're dreaming about. You walk home slowly, jar in hand, thinking of how desire bends the rules, how even in a world of sermons and shame, people still snuck herbs into handkerchiefs and names into bread loaves, not because they were witches, but because they were human, and humans, inconveniently, fall in love, even with bad odds, even with worse recipes. You're seated in a cold stone room that smells like garlic, dried sweat, and intellectual overconfidence. On the wall hangs a faded anatomical chart that looks more like a medieval map of a haunted castle than anything remotely biological. A monk with a serious beard and even more serious eyebrows stands before it, pointer stick in hand, ready to explain how the human body really works. You prepare yourself. He begins with confidence and a firm nod, like a man about to explain where babies come from using celestial metaphors and 3 vegetables. According to him, the body contains 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, each ruled by a planet, a season, and probably a goat if you press him. When these humours are balanced, you are healthy. When they are not, you are either angry, weepy, lethargic, or cursed. You raise your hand. Where are the kidneys? He waves you off. Irrelevant. Let's talk about the womb. Here we go. He points to a diagram of what looks like a poorly folded glove. The female womb, he declares, has 7 chambers. You blink. He continues. 3 on the left, 3 on the right, and 1 in the centre. Male children grow on the right, females on the left. The centre is, well, let us say, less stable. He leans in, almost gleeful. Some scholars believe the centre chamber is where monsters form. Of course they do. Several medieval medical texts describe the uterus as a multi-chambered organ, with different compartments producing different outcomes. The logic, if you can call it that, stemmed from ancient theories by Greek and Roman physicians, muddled through centuries of speculation and just enough religious anxiety to keep it spicy. The theory continues. If conception occurs in the wrong chamber, the child might be born with too much heat, a warrior, too little heat, a scholar. Or, if the centre chamber is involved, scales. You ask what causes the embryo to land in one chamber over another. He replies, star alignment, or diet, or sin. Naturally, and now for the real gem, orgasm is required for pregnancy. Yes, according to many medieval physicians, a woman could not conceive unless she experienced climax. It was believed her body needed to release its own seed to meet the man's seed mid-journey. If she didn't enjoy it, no baby, which led to some spectacular legal loopholes in rape trials. By the way, but we'll table that nightmare for a future sigh. You raise your hand again, so what happens if she does enjoy it? But nothing happens. The monk frowns. Then she was not pious enough. Of course, this leads him into a discussion of wandering wombs, a phenomenon where the uterus detaches from its usual location and roams the body like a confused spirit. Common symptoms: hysteria, fainting, inappropriate laughter. The solution: garlic smoke, preferably wafted upward. You're not told how. You make a mental note to never mention garlic around him again. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, onions and garlic were inserted in certain areas to attract the womb back down when it was believed to be drifting dangerously close to the lungs or brain. You do not ask how they discovered this. You simply light a candle for the test subject and move on. Historians still argue whether these womb theories were based more on observation, superstition, or men being too afraid to ask follow-up questions. Some say the theory originated from genuine attempts to map symptoms. Others argue it's what happens when you let people write textbooks without involving a single uterus owner. The monk pivots. Now we're talking about male anatomy, which he explains with far less mystery and far more metaphor. He compares the testes to bubbling furnaces, essential for cooking seed. The right testicle produces boys, the left, girls. This is why many men of the time believed that sleeping on one side or tying off one, furnace, could influence the outcome. The science, dubious. The confidence, impressive. You ask about contraception. He scoffs. Then, reluctantly, he admits that some herbalists prescribe wild carrot seed or honey mixed with fish bladder as a preventative. But he warns these are likely the work of witches, midwives, or dangerously curious wives. You glance at your notes. So far, you have: the womb is a 7-door labyrinth with a monster closet. Garlic is both salad and salvation. Orgasms are legally binding. Breathing wrong can lead to spontaneous hysteria. Sounds about right. You peek at his books. One is titled On the Generation of Animals. Another, Secrets of Women. A third has no title, just a drawing of a man sneezing into a loaf of bread. You're afraid to ask. You sit through another 15 minutes of confident nonsense about the liver being the seat of emotion and the spleen causing jealousy. The monk pauses occasionally to sip from a mug that smells like mead and unresolved trauma. He then gestures to a small wooden model of the body. It's inaccurate. Everything is either missing, misaligned, or hauntingly optimistic. The heart is located in the throat. The lungs are shaped like tulips. The reproductive organs are a single mysterious blob labelled Essence Junction. You stare at it the way one might stare at a drawing of a horse made by someone who has never seen a horse and refuses to Google it out of pride. Eventually, the monk finishes. He's proud. He smiles. He says he hopes you're better prepared now to understand the sacred vessel that is man and the mysterious mirror that is woman. You pretend to take notes, and then, finally, you leave outside. The air feels clearer. Your lungs, thankfully, haven't wandered. A cat walks past you and looks vaguely more medically accurate than anything you just witnessed. You stop by the apothecary's again and tell her about the garlic smoke womb theory. She snorts. Typical. Men lose one scroll and invent 12 wombs. You ask her what she believes. She shrugs. I believe in pain, cycles, and hunger. Everything else is storytelling. You walk on, thinking about how long people have been drawing bodies without asking the bodies how they feel, about how anatomy was once as much philosophy as it was flesh, and how some theories weren't born from ignorance but from sheer, determined guessing, and maybe, just maybe, a little too much garlic. The road ahead stretches wide, dusty, and inexplicably holy, not because it's clean, it's not, but because it's a pilgrimage route, and that means every stone, every footprint, every badly carved saint statue is officially sacred. You walk it not because you're devout, necessarily, but because you're curious, and because, let's be honest, people on pilgrimages have a curious habit of forgetting to be celibate. The man beside you has blisters. The woman behind you has 2 children and a donkey with an attitude problem. Up ahead, someone singing about St. James and possibly ale. It's unclear. Welcome to the Spiritual Loophole Expressway. Pilgrimages were sold as journeys of penance. You left home with a humble heart, a pack full of hard cheese, and an eager desire to see the bones of a long-dead martyr. You were supposed to walk, pray, and repent. Instead, what many pilgrims did was walk, flirt, and accidentally share tents with strangers from other parishes. Pilgrimage routes in the Middle Ages doubled as social highways. They were one of the rare times people of different classes, towns, and even countries mingled freely. A noble woman and a peasant could walk the same road. A monk and a widow could discuss theology, or anything else. Under the same tree, rules relaxed when everyone smelled equally terrible. In theory, this was a chance for introspection. In practice, it was a medieval road trip with only vague supervision. At the next crossroads, you pass a bathhouse. Yes, a real one, built by a local abbey for weary travellers. You step inside out of curiosity and the immediate need to not smell like spiritual rot. Inside, steam fills the air. Men and women lounge in towels. A group of Germans argue about relics while soaking their feet. In the far corner, someone is definitely making eye contact that isn't doctrinal. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some places, pilgrimage bathhouses were so notorious for hookups that bishops had to issue formal complaints. One decree from Avignon lamented the carnal distractions of the route to Santiago. Another called certain bathhouses pagan dens of heat and heresy, which, honestly, sounds like the tagline of a very niche spa. Outside, the road narrows through a village known for its relic, a saint's toenail, possibly real, definitely monetized. Vendors sell pins, bread, and a blessed balm that smells suspiciously like lard. You stop to admire a painted banner of the Virgin Mary that appears to be giving side-eye to a pair of pilgrims holding hands. You're beginning to understand why the church had mixed feelings, because while pilgrimage was designed to bring people closer to God, it also brought them closer to each other, intimately, geographically, sometimes anatomically, and since everyone was technically away from home, the rules blurred like cheap ink on wet parchment. Historians still argue whether this blurring was willfully ignored by clergy or managed quietly with confession booths at every major checkpoint. Some abbots tolerated it as a necessary byproduct. Others cracked down with sermons, curfews, and the occasional exorcism just to be safe. Further along, you meet a group of 3 women travelling alone. They call themselves cousins. You raise an eyebrow. One winks. They share a tent, a mule, and apparently an extremely well-hidden stash of dried figs. At night, they sing bawdy songs in Latin and pretend they don't know the translations. You share a fire with them, and one tells you about a monk she met in Poitiers. He had very deep thoughts, she says, then adds, and very nice shoulders. You don't ask for details. You just pass the wine. The stars above are clear, the rules below less so. Here's your second historical fact. Some pilgrim hostels had gender-segregated sleeping quarters that were routinely ignored. It wasn't uncommon for guards or innkeepers to be bribed with bread, coin, or flattery to lose track of who slept where. After all, Who's going to track celibacy among 200 blistered, exhausted people who've been sleeping outdoors for weeks? And then there were the priests. Not all of them, of course, but some. Some were known for offering pastoral care in the form of massages, advice, and mildly inappropriate psalms. A German bishop once complained that his clergy returned from pilgrimage with lighter spirits, heavier purses, and at least one suspicious rash. Officially, he was ignored. You arrive in a city famous for its cathedral and infamous for its night markets. Lanterns swing over the crowd like sleepy fireflies. Musicians play lutes out of tune but with conviction. A man with a relic box offers blessings in exchange for silver and directions to the nearest wine hall. You see two pilgrims kissing under a statue of Saint Agnes. You see a nun sipping mead and pretending not to listen. You see life, messy and hungry, weaving its way through the sacred. Back at your hostel, someone is snoring. Someone else is whispering the name of someone they met 2 towns ago. You lie down on your straw pallet and realize people travel to escape, yes, but also to explore, and sometimes to connect in ways that have nothing to do with holy bones. Pilgrimage, for all its piety, was also a loophole, a sanctioned absence, a geographical absolution. You could step away from your old life, try something wild, say it was part of your penance, and go home with cleaner feet and more complicated memories. Was it spiritual? Sometimes. Was it lustful? Occasionally. Was it deeply human? Always. You wake to bells, not church bells, plague bells. They toll slow and heavy, like time has thickened. Someone in the alley is shouting about divine punishment. Someone else is boiling vinegar. You crack the shutters and see a man wearing a beak full of herbs sprinting past a chicken cart. It's not even sunrise yet. The Black Death has arrived, and so is everyone's inner chaos. You trudge to the square, where a priest is already halfway through a sermon delivered at full volume and zero nuance. He's standing on a barrel, waving a crucifix, and blaming lust, greed, vanity, astrology, foreigners, and probably parsley for the plague. Behind him, a sign reads, "Repent or rot." You half expect a menu on the other side. The crowd listens because what else are you going to do when the air feels contagious and the birds are leaving town? But here's what you don't expect. Despite the panic, people aren't becoming saints. They're getting married. A lot. Quickly. Impulsively. Sometimes with strangers. Sometimes with the person they swore off 3 plagues ago. There's a kind of manic optimism in the air. Like maybe if you tie your life to someone else's fast enough, you'll dodge the sight. And here's another historical fact to your list. Marriage rates soared during the Black Death. Not because people were romantic, but because people were terrified. Marrying off a daughter meant 1 fewer mouth to feed and 1 more chance of grandchildren before extinction. For some, it was logistical. For others, it was sheer last-call desperation. One town issued a decree allowing people to marry without parental approval, priestly presence, or even coherent vows. Just say something vaguely binding in front of 2 witnesses and boom! You're hitched. In some cases, the witnesses were livestock. No one checked. You pass a brothel with its door open. Business is booming. You pause. Surely not. Right? Wrong. The madam waves you inside. She's wearing a scarf over her nose and a sprig of rosemary pinned to her bodice. 2 florins if you don't cough, she says. 3 if you do. This is your quirky tidbit. Some medieval brothels added plague surcharges or quick visit discounts during epidemics. Because commerce, like bacteria, adapts fast. The logic was baffling. Death is coming. So let's feel something first. Or maybe it was just habit. Too strong to break even with half the city turning blue. Historians still argue whether this surge in intimacy was defiance, denial, or simply a deep-seated human need to be touched before it's all over. Probably a mix. You see a woman embrace her fevered husband, lips trembling. You see a man write his name on the city wall next to someone else's, just in case. You see lovers running hand in hand past the quarantine guards like it's a festival. Back at the market, a man is proposing, loudly. He has no ring, only an onion and a poem. She says yes, or maybe just sneezes in agreement. Either way, they kiss, and everyone cheers, then steps away, nervously. You hear of a baker who got married 3 times in 1 month. Not because he's a heartbreaker, but because the first 2 wives didn't make it past the feast. The third is still hanging on. For now, at night, the taverns are still full, the wine flows, The lute plays a little faster, a little off-key. People dance like the floor is vanishing. Because in a way, it is. Someone jokes that the fleas are throwing their own wedding banquet. You laugh. A little, then drink more. And then there's the flagellants. They arrive in town shirtless and bleeding, whipping themselves in rhythm to psalms. They sing, they chant, they claim this will cleanse sin and stop the plague. You ask what their stance is on kissing. They say only if it hurts. You step aside. The church, for its part, is struggling. One bishop flees the city. Another builds a massive pyre and tells everyone to throw in anything sinful. Jewellery, dice, love letters. The fire burns for 3 days. On the 4th, the plague gets worse. You meet a scribe who's been copying obituaries so long. He starts adding jokes. Here lies Marjorie. She loved bread, hated Mondays, and definitely didn't cause the apocalypse. He passes you a draft. Too soon. He asks, possibly. But the truth is, in the face of death, people get strange, not always noble, not always logical, but profoundly human. They marry fast. They touch recklessly. They tell secrets they've hidden for decades. They say yes when they normally would have said maybe. You hear of a woman who confessed to loving her neighbour's wife, then kissed her, then died the next day. Her neighbour buried her with a pressed violet and a note that read, I would have said yes. You learn that plague wasn't just a biological event. It was a social earthquake. It cracked open the rules, pulled back the curtains, and let all the buried longing out. Even the monks stopped pretending. One writes in his diary, if I must die, let it be in sunlight, with someone's hand in mine. A week later, his entry ends mid-sentence. And that's the thing. No matter how many sermons tell you to fear desire, when the sky falls, it's not sin people chase. It's closeness. That last warm touch, that last kiss, that last half-drunk I think I love you. Maybe that's why so many refuse to isolate, not because they were foolish, but because they didn't want to die alone. In a room that smelled like vinegar and regret, the plague takes millions, but it never quite kills hope. Even now, as you pass the plague cart rattling toward the cemetery, you hear music behind a closed door. Someone is laughing. Someone else is whispering a name. And somewhere, under a bed that creaks with life, 2 people are making a vow neither expects to keep, but means completely in that moment. Because sometimes, love isn't about forever. It's about before it's too late. You walk into the cathedral with your hat in your hand, your breath slow, and a faint ache in your feet that you can't quite blame on the stairs. The light is thin and reverent, filtering through stained glass like it's afraid to wake the statues. You expected silence. You didn't expect company. Every wall here remembers someone. Stone saints look down with carved halos and faint smirks, as if they know things the scribes never wrote. One of them clutches a book. Another, a palm branch. One has an expression so quietly scandalized you suspect he's judging the choir boy's haircut. But beneath the piety, just under the marble, there's something else. A hand carved too close to a hip. A smoothed-over breastplate detail that might once have been a clasp. A pair of saints standing suspiciously shoulder to shoulder, sharing a look that has very little to do with divine revelation. You sit in the rear pew and notice how many of the memorial inscriptions mention virtues. Piety, loyalty, generosity to the poor. Almost none of them mention desire, or affection, or even affection's less diplomatic cousin. That was left, elsewhere, and yet it lingers. There's a tomb to your left, elaborate and dust-covered, built for a noblewoman whose name you've seen in 4 different family trees, none of which agree on who she married. What they do agree on is this. She wrote letters, a lot of them, none to her husband, all to a man whose name was scratched out in every surviving copy, except one, found folded inside a psalter, pressed between 2 prayers. Her handwriting, his name. You run your fingers across her carved likeness. Stone veil, delicate mouth, hands folded with patience no one alive could have verified. But she didn't ask to be remembered for faith. She asked to be remembered by him. She chose that. And that, perhaps, was the boldest thing a woman in her position could do. Your first historical fact. Medieval tomb inscriptions were often commissioned not by the dead, but by the survivors, families, religious houses, political allies, which means what's remembered is not always what was real, and what's erased, often the most honest part. You pass a smaller stone, just initials, worn into anonymity. At its base, Someone once carved a tiny flower, 5 petals, slightly asymmetrical. You wonder if it was for a lover, or a child, or someone who didn't fit into the church's neat version of memory. Someone coughs nearby, not in the alive way, in the statue's haunted way. You move on, and then you see them, the wax death masks, rows of them, housed in a side chapel, noblemen, matriarchs, 1 or 2 whose names no one remembers, but whose noses are still impressively defiant. The wax is yellowed with age, the eyes closed in a way that feels staged, but what catches you are the lips, not serene, not holy, just unfinished, like they were about to say something when the mould set. One has a slight smirk, another, a scowl. One, swear to God, looks like she's seconds from bursting into laughter. You half expect her to wink. Historians still argue whether these masks were made for memory or power. Some say they honoured the dead, others argue they served political purpose, proving lineage, preserving legacy, reminding visitors that mortality has an excellent sense of timing, but they're not just relics. They're emotional fossils. You find a ledger tucked behind the altar, a list of donations, most from noblemen, religious orders, the occasional enthusiastic bishop. But in one corner, there's a note, scribbled sideways, about 10 florins and a carved comb from Lady Me, to be placed under his pillow. No last name, no context, just that. Maybe that was love, or guilt, or both. You think back on everything this place has seen, marriages for property, affairs that outlasted kingdoms, secret vows muttered in hallways lit only by candlelight and extremely selective memory. You think of the lovers buried apart, the ones buried too close, the ones buried next to someone else's name. And here's your quirky tidbit. In one 15th century cathedral, a monk discovered a pair of lovers buried side by side, holding hands under the stone. The church said it was symbolic of fraternal unity. The townspeople said it was symbolic of romantic boldness. The archivist quietly moved on. You step outside for air. It smells like rain and stone and old incense, the kind that clings to your coat like regret. A bell rings. Someone is lighting votives inside. You lean against the wall and notice graffiti. Not new, medieval, scratched into the stone centuries ago. A heart, an initial, a small, crude drawing of 2 figures holding hands, both in robes, monastic love, artistic mischief, or just someone trying to make their feelings permanent when parchment wasn't private enough. Because here's the thing, sex, love, and longing didn't vanish in cathedrals. They whispered in alcoves. They curled under funeral cloths. They rode on the backs of letters and lived in the margins of chronicles no one thought to censor. You think of all the people history called sinners, witches, heretics, scandalous, shameful, and realise those are often just labels slapped onto anyone who loved outside the script. You look up one last time. A stained glass window catches the fading light, and for a moment, you swear one of the painted angels is giving you a wink. Or maybe you're just tired. Either way, you smile, because the past was never as clean as the tombstones suggest. And memory has a naughty habit of keeping exactly what it shouldn't. The cathedral fades behind you, swallowed by evening. The cobblestones feel softer now, as if the centuries have worn them into lullabies. You walk slowly, not from fatigue, but because something in the air is asking you not to rush. Maybe it's the memory of the wax faces, or the smell of old incense still clinging to your sleeves. Or maybe it's just the weight of all the stories people weren't supposed to tell. The wind is gentler now, a little cooler. You pass the same brothel, the same chapel, the same cracked statue with one wing chipped off. They don't look different, but you do, a little more aware, a little more amused, and strangely, a little more comforted. You realise history was never sterile. It was sweaty, awkward, loud, longing, tender in places it wasn't supposed to be. People loved in ways they weren't allowed to, desired when they were told not to, hid things in embroidery, in margins, in soft songs and bad Latin, and they did it all while trying to survive plagues, sermons, taxes, heartbreak, and dinner. So tonight, as you crawl into bed, remember that the past was never neat. It was human, and so are you. Close your eyes now. Let the flicker of cathedral candles soften into the dim glow behind your eyelids. Let the whisper of forgotten names float just out of reach. And if you dream of someone brushing past you in the shadow of a stone arch, smiling like they've kept a secret for 600 years, don't worry, that just means the history worked. Sleep well, time traveller. You survived the Middle Ages. Barely.